I was asked to talk today about an issue that I think is one that's absolutely fundamental to good communities across Canada. This is an issue that causes people to either do really, really well in terms of their volunteer experience or to stumble badly. This is an issue that allows people to provide effective service in their municipalities in a variety of ways, or it causes people to absolutely be frustrated, throw up their hands in desperation, and resign early. All of it is focused around something called governance. And just for those of you that take notes, it always encourages a speaker when you do, because I think I've said something profound, which I haven't. But in any case, for those of you that take notes, governance is, for me, is a simple definition. I was asked that yesterday, actually. What's governance? Governance is the process, or the art, the process of decision-making by corporate leaders. So when we talk governance, we're talking what process of decision-making are you involved in as an organization? What does this process look like? How clear is that to you? Who has what role in this process? I talk about how people make decisions. I make decisions when I go to restaurants by jumping to the conclusion, which is I ask the waitress, what's the special? And providing it doesn't sound something awfully foreign, I say, I think I'll have that. And the answer is I just jump to a conclusion. My wife, on the other hand, will take the menu and pore over every chapter of the thing, and an hour later we'll have decided on what to have, which by and large is the special. It's like how people separate themselves when they go shopping, typically, and it's a gender-based issue, because most men go shopping, they go hunting. And when women go shopping, they go grazing. And therein lies the stress between husbands and wives, because the husband's sitting down at the cinnamon place, having the second cinnamon bun and third coffee, waiting for their spouse to look over the same outfit at 5 different stores. The husband goes to the store like I do, buys a suit. My wife says, well, what about all these other menswear stores? I said, no, I saw one I liked. But you didn't check it out. I said, yeah, I've checked it out. It's good. It's a different process. It's called decision making. So what's wrong with one versus the other? Probably nothing when you're talking about something fairly simple. When you're talking about governing organizations, when you're talking about making decisions on behalf of others, the process is a lot more complex, because you're now taking into effect and into account how others view the decision that you're about to make. So whether you're governing in an organization that has 30 or 40 or 100 staff, or in the case of Strathcona County, and there are a few employees here from there, they have a 920 full-time staff, as I recall, because somebody sent an email out to 919 of them. This was an issue in the paper recently. So that, that's a large organization with a lot of resources. Some of you have an organization where you have a board on the one hand that meets on Tuesday night for a board meeting, and on Saturday morning you're actually running the farmer's market, or you're working on the ball diamond, or you're doing whatever, doing the trail system. And so the staffing is either negligible or non-existent. And so when I'm talking today, I'm going to try to cover both fields. Those of you that would have staff that work with you in the organization, and those of you that are also involved as volunteer leaders on the one hand. On the other hand, you're volunteer workers trying to get the stuff done on behalf of the organizations. So I'll give you a bit of my own background as to why you ought to be here and pay attention and listen and take notes. Go ahead, Tim. I'm not sure if it's up there. I've spent the last 34 years working with municipalities, provincial crown corporations, agencies like yours. There's a huge variety of organizations across Canada. That's the kind of work that I do. I've worked in all 10 provinces. I said to somebody today, I've worked from Sydney on Cape Breton Island, or Cape Breton, part of Nova Scotia, to Sydney on Vancouver Island, and from Milk River in southern Alberta to Iqaluit in the territory of Nunavut or Nunavut, depending on how you think about it. So there's a wide variety of organizations locked in that. I've spent time working in organizations, spent time chairing boards. Probably my most difficult chairing experience was the one of the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, because they had 67 board members. Can you imagine? 67 people around the table, speaking both languages, and I'm chairing. And the first item on the agenda, I called for anybody that wanted to talk to the item. Had 19 hands went up. So I reminded them that we had a board meeting that was supposed to go from 8 until 5, and if we had 19 hands on every issue, we'd never make it. regardless of how fast I thought I was as a chairman, we'd never make it, and so people kind of cut back. One of the principles you learn about working with politicians is that as long as the name is in the news or name is in the minutes, it sort of indicates they were actually at the meeting, and once they've done that once, it was okay, we got through the rest of the meeting. With your board meetings, I guess the question is, how effective are you at doing what you're doing, and a part of that is what we're going to cover today. The other thing that I would point out is, I'm not even sure it's up there, but part of my writing, which I do every month for an organization called Municipal World. If you like the topic of governance, there's an article in there monthly that I'm supposed to be writing called The Governance Zone. That's available to you. It's not a very expensive magazine. And there's also 4 books that are available through Municipal World. So that's some of the background. In terms of today, I want to talk about what's the target, what's governance all about. Go ahead, Tim. I'm going to talk about board structures and how that changes because of the kind of organization you're from. I'm going to talk about board principles. I'm going to talk about roles and responsibilities, who does what. And I'm going to talk about what are some of the key mechanisms of governance, talk about board recruitment, tenure, board meetings, and then we're going to have a period of question and answer. So our objectives for today, we're going to try to provide some training on the skills that are needed to become a more capable leader and a more effective board. One of the things that challenges me is this whole question of, am I adding value? And at my late stage of life, I tell people I'm not interested in working with organizations that aren't interested in helping themselves. I'm not interested in simply showing up. I'm not interested in coming to the seminar if you can't leave today with having made at least one note to say we ought to change, or we ought to examine, or we ought to be talking to each other about how we can improve and fill in the blank. If there's not something at the end of today that you can say, I've learned something that we could apply in our organization that's useful, then today's a waste. And I don't want to waste your time. It's valuable for all of us. So any session like this, we should be learning from each other. You should be learning from, hopefully, some of the principles that I lay out, and these principles should help you manage, govern your organizations. So to talk about that, talk about the target is aimed at the leadership of Alberta's voluntary sector. You guys provide an unbelievable array of services. I've said to people, in fact, in a magazine recently, they asked, one of the questions was, what's one of the challenges coming up in the future of our society? And in my view, one of our great challenges is going to be this whole issue of the impact on volunteerism by the next generation. And I say that with great respect, but I say it because we have not done a very good job as parents and grandparents of actually grinding into our grandchildren and children the notion that there's great value in serving others. We've done a lousy job of saying to people that not all of the world can be changed and accessed and so on by touching your BlackBerry. You actually have to get off your duff and go to a meeting and contribute and talk and resolve issues and volunteer services if our communities are going to come alive. And if municipalities had to provide all these services themselves to their tax base, all of our taxes would be up at least 100%. I can guarantee you we would not have the services we have today. Without service clubs, without churches, without volunteer sport organizations, I mean, the whole community would be much the poorer, I can tell you. So one of our challenges to the group in this room is to encourage others to come alongside. And if we're not able to do that through a whole variety of mechanisms, I think we fail badly. And I'm not saying that a younger generation is going to come alongside and do the same things you're doing, because they actually communicate, as you know, in different ways. They actually focus in different ways, and we have to become more relevant at focusing partly on where they're at and partly to get them to see the value in serving others. And one of the great achievements of life, in my view, is you serving others. Somebody said to me, in fact, I was interviewed this morning by this same crew at the back, and one of the questions was, what is the most successful or rewarding thing you've done in the last, or in your career? I'm not entirely sure the question. And I spoke about this children's camp in Romania. It has nothing to do with me personally. It's not something I've done and got paid for. It has everything to do with trying to help somebody else. And I'm convinced that that's what adds value to your life, is this notion of serving others. So how are you serving others, and how do you do that effectively? Because our time is valuable. We don't want to be frustrated. We don't want to be bashing heads with each other at board meetings and trying to get people up to speed and all that kind of stuff. That's really what we're talking about in terms of target. So what's governance? And I talked about it, I said this process of exercising leadership. And this process of exercising leadership in your organization is done by the governing body, which in your case is a board, I presume, or a council if you're part of a municipality. On behalf of who? On behalf of the membership. The membership provides services to others, but members are what's important to you. To the organization and those we serve in terms of purpose, control, and future. You're saying part of what we're trying to do is to ensure that the purpose of our organization, what's called the raison d'etre of the organization, is in actual fact looked after because we're focused around providing service that focuses on the goals and objectives of our organization. So one of those, the clarity of goals and objectives is absolutely essential. I have people that establish organizations, they put a title on it, and then they start talking about appointing members. But you're missing one key chapter, and it's called terms of reference. What are these folks actually going to do at this organization? Otherwise, you're frustrated from the get-go. So don't allow yourself to be created as an organization. Think of your own and say, what qualifies as our terms of reference? If I'm inviting somebody to join and they say, well, what action do you do? Do we have a statement that says, here's the following 5 things that we focus on? What's the terms of reference of our organization? That's essentially what that says. How do we control it? We control it through a business plan. We control it through our budget. We control it through our constitution. We control it through our bylaws. There's a whole lot of control mechanisms if you think about that clearly. We control it through the job descriptions of our executive. And we talk about our future in terms of where to from here. Every one of your organizations, whether it's a church board or a ag society or a rural electrification organization, should have an absolute clear mandate in terms of here's 3 or 4 things that we want to accomplish over the next 12 to 18 months. Every one of your organizations, if I came to visit you and said to you, what are you working on? What's on the front part of your agenda? I would like to know that on a monthly basis, when you sit down at a meeting, part of your meeting is given over to, are we moving the yardsticks? Are we doing something that moves progress ahead? Or are we simply meeting for the sake of meeting? One of the great films of all time is one of the old films, I think it's now on YouTube actually, it's the one that stars John Cleese, he of Monty Python fame. And John Cleese did a film, it was a training film back in the Dark Ages, which is where I came from. And it was called Meetings, Bloody Meetings. He also did one on performance reviews, which was another classic. It was only his style. He just added such great humor. But anyway, it shows him getting into bed at night, as I recall the movie. Shows him getting into bed at night on his side of the bed, his wife on her side of the bed. She's putting off the light, he's putting on the light. When he gets into bed, he starts opening up all these file folders in front of him on the bed sheets. And his wife looks at him and says, what are you doing? And he says, I'm working. These are classic questions, by the way. And she says, what were you doing at work today? He thinks for a moment, he says, I was in meetings. And then she asks another classic question. She says, why were you meeting? And he thinks for a moment, he says, because it's Thursday. You know, if the only reason why you're meeting folks is because it's Thursday, it's not a very good reason. If you can go home at the end of a day's meeting or an evening's meeting and your significant other across the spouse says, you just took 3 hours out of our time together, you were at a meeting today, what did you accomplish? The question I would have to you is, could you fill in the blank? Could you absolutely say to your significant other across the pillow, the reason we had a meeting was twofold, and here it is. Geez, folks, you got 20 items on the agenda. Can you not tell me 2 things that you worked on at that meeting that were significant? Because if you can't, my question would be, why meet? I've had organizations that meet twice a year. I had a municipal council, by the way, believe it or not, in Nova Scotia that met twice a year. We have councils that meet every 2 weeks. The question is your job to come and sort of baptize the agenda, or is your job to actually accomplish something in the course of what it is you're doing? So the question is sort of why meet? And then it talks about providing oversight. What is this oversight role? It's sort of the leaning in, the saying, are we focused on what it is we said we would do? Are we delivering the service we said we would deliver? Are we accomplishing the things we said we would accomplish? Are we fulfilling the roles we said we would fulfill? Is our chairman or president doing what we said the president or chairman would do? Is there an executive that forms its role? Does the executive get to meet off-site somewhere else and make other decisions and run them past us every month or every 2 months, which has happened in some of your organizations? Are we allowed to change the very nature of who we are, which happened in one of the ag societies I reviewed a while ago, where the organization was being changed overnight without the endorsement of the membership? Are you allowed to do that? Are you allowed to meet off-site and have an impromptu meeting and change the whole nature of what it is you do? Can you have an organization that's hijacked by your executive that takes it in a completely different direction? See, the questions I'm asking you are all around this one question called oversight. What's our role as leaders of the organization in making sure that we are actually doing what it is we said we would do? Can we take our organization, which is designed to do this, and move it over here and do something quite contrary? Who allows us to do that? That's a question of oversight. How do we as a board ensure that we look at our mandate and say, are we delivering on the mandate? Are we delivering on what we said we would do in terms of goals and priorities? Have we ensured that our executive is doing what they said they would do? When the chairman of our board speaks or our president speaks, are they speaking on behalf of all of us? Or are they just simply saying things that they think might be right? What authority does our chair have to commit us to do anything? It's a good question. I can tell you most chairs don't know the answer to that question. Can you stand up? Can the mayor of Strathcona County stand up and say, we'll do this? The answer is she can't. Why? Because she's one of 9, and the one of 9 does not constitute a majority. 5 does, but not 1. You've got a board of 15 members around your board table, perhaps. A democracy is called 8 beat 7. Simple. It's rather crude, isn't it? But it is simple. Everybody loves democracy, by the way, until they're part of the 7. And then somehow the other board members didn't understand your point of view, and if only you could hammer them again, they'd understand it better. The answer is they won't. There's an old expression that says, when the horse is dead, dismount. Next. So what are some of these key principles? What things actually drive an organization and allow it to function? So you just, if you do nothing else, put a check mark beside the things you think, boy, we seem to have a real handle on that, or put a question mark and say, are we? What are we doing in terms of this? So one of the key principles is this clarity of mandate and authority to act. What does that in your organization? What gives you your mandate, your reason to be, and your authority to act? What defines the turf on which you're allowed to perform? What allows you to make good decisions that are going to be actually upheld by your membership? And I would argue that for most of you, it probably lies in your constitution, lies in your bylaws. It's there in terms of position descriptions, but it's there in your organization. It might be a piece of provincial legislation, for example, the Rural Utilities Act, the Agricultural Societies Act. So some of this is in legislation. For a majority of you, though, there's no legislation. You're there as a volunteer organization that folks in the past helped create, or perhaps you did, and it has a mandate statement somewhere that says, here's what we're about. So how clear is that? Because quite frankly, if you don't get number 1 right, the rest of it's not going to matter. As a person said, I may be lost, but I'm making record time. The importance of that is that organizations are waking up and saying, we need to be oriented to what we're doing. We elect mayors and councillors, reeves and councillors across Alberta, and we do not prepare them for what they're getting themselves into. So one of the key steps is to say, what's the orientation look like? What's our role? Because one of the problems that you're facing is that you get people in an audience like this who come at it from a management or a service perspective. You're all managers or servers in your own organizations that you come out of. You then go to an evening board meeting and you're called governors. So what happened in this transition? What role changed in our heads between us managing and now us governing? What's this role look like? Can you imagine the challenge for somebody that's a former optometrist who now becomes the mayor of, and fill in the blank? Can you imagine somebody who's been a very successful businessman in downtown Spruce Grove, where I'm from, and becomes the mayor and realizes I can't run this community the way I run my own business? I mean, that's the challenge. because his role is so significantly different. So the question is, how do we orient our own members? Do you have a process of orientation in your organization? You bring on new members all the time, presumably. Members change, people come, people go. So how do you orient new people to how you do your business? It's a good question. Thirdly, we talk about, do we have a good, transparent, and sound process of decision making? When we make decisions, this is where the rubber hits the road. When you make a decision, do you have confidence that it's the right one? And how do you have that confidence? Do you have a starting point in the decision-making process? Do you ensure that everybody has the information on the table that they need to make a good decision? And when they get to the end of the decision-making process, do people say, yep, we've done it, we've accomplished something? Is the information provided to all members at the same time, or do some members get more information than others? Is information held back? Are there surprises partway through the process? Flexibility on the issues. It simply says, I can be flexible on issues, but I'm not flexible on my principles. I can be flexible in terms of, do I believe this, do I believe that, do I adjust here, do I adjust that? What you don't adjust is your basic commitment to your own personal principles. I tell people I'm a fundamentalist. I fundamentally believe in integrity. I fundamentally believe in honesty. I fundamentally believe in fair play. I fundamentally believe in sort of a lack of gender discrimination. I fundamentally believe in a whole series of things that are important to me that I'm not about to give up on because I'm a part of an organization. What I'm not fundamentally committed to is this decision versus that one. A good decision-making process, and just write that on the side of your page there somewhere, a good decision-making process consists of three key elements. Three key elements. The first element is the background reports. And some of you may have a scarcity of that. Others of you got all kinds of good background information. Somebody's helping to draft up the agenda, puts together the background report, and says, here's the issue and here's why we need a decision by the board. So part one is a backgrounder. What's the issue? Why is it an issue? What are the budget implications? What's the policy implications? What makes this an issue, and what's the recommendation to resolve it? That's what a board needs in front of it. Don't make a decision based on what I just described. Why? Because you're missing the other two elements. The second element is the discussion with any staff at the meeting. So somebody who's working as your executive director of the Chamber of Commerce has more access to more information than you do as a board member, I'll guarantee you. If it's an ag society, you may have one or two staff members that come to the board meeting. So ask questions. The third part of it is the dialogue with other members. Dialogue with other members. What does everybody else around the table have to say, and what do they contribute to your decision-making process? Those things are critical. So I say to people, the last thing you want to do is when you get an agenda package, is start emailing each other and saying, do I have your support on such and such an issue? Why on earth would you think of asking that question when you haven't heard the other two parts? You haven't asked staff more questions when you get to the meeting, and you sure as heck haven't heard the dialogue amongst the members. And one of these days, and particularly in government circles, local government in particular, somebody's going to get hammered for making decisions by email. You're going to show up at a council meeting in one of your counties or urban municipalities, and you're going to figure out and say, gee, that decision went through fairly fast. I thought it was a big issue. Only to find out that everybody resolved it by email before they came to the meeting. It's not allowed, by the way, it's illegal. Your organization, you have to say, does our board make decisions at the table? I'll talk about that in a moment. One of the basic principles of good governance is called primacy of the table. Primacy of the table. And primacy of the table says we make our decisions at our governing table. We don't make them in committee. We don't make them by some outside process. We don't make them like the former town of Lac-La-Biche that's had 4 members of council meet at the former mayor's hotel room and discuss issues and decide how to act, and the other 3 met at somebody's house and did the same thing. It's a predictable body when you're split 4-3 and you've already made up your mind before you ever come to the table. Why? Because you absolutely defied this principle of decision-making at the table, primacy at the table. Respect for fellow board members says, I don't have to agree with you. Chances are we won't. It's amazing. I mean, I find it really humorous to see people at their first board meeting and they look at each other thinking, where'd you come from? Geez, how'd you come up with that idea? I thought this was, The last thing you want to say, by the way, to your family is, this is a short agenda, I'll be home early. It never works. Somebody will find one item and they'll beat it to death, and you'll think, what on earth is wrong with it? Anyway, respect for members says, I can learn to disagree agreeably. I can learn to focus on the issue, not on your face. I can learn to focus on why we disagree as opposed to, I find you disagreeable. I served as a mayor for 12 years with some of the same people. I could meet any one of them on the street today and go and have a coffee together. Why? Because we decided at the outset, and I decided as mayor. I had one guy in my council for 12 years that I disagreed with. A couple in the audience here will know who that is because they're from Spruce Grove. But Councillor Walker and I never quite saw eye to eye. But you know something? I never dumped on him personally. I never dumped on him publicly. And at the end of the day, we just recognized we often disagreed. I tell people that on my council, I had everybody from Mother Teresa on the left to Attila the Hun on the right, which gave me lots of room in the middle to find consensus. And that's often the case at a board table. You have people all over the map on an issue, and part of the job of a chairman is to try to draw people to the middle. Where's the common ground that we can move forward on? So we have respect. Full disclosure of relevant information says that whatever is relevant to this point, put it on the table now. Don't talk about this in the parking lot after the meeting. If it's critical, I need to know now if I'm going to be making a good decision. Don't hide anything. If you're a staff member and you report to a board, this is an absolute career changer. This is a game breaker. This is something in which you'll end a career in a hurry. Is this lack of respect for others by holding back information. Focus on results, again, gets back to my original point that says you want to have a good principle of good governance. It's sort of to make sure that you have an understanding of what end are you seeking before you start the process. Where are you going with this? What are we trying to accomplish? Are we simply having, for example, an Ag Society event? Is that the issue? Or are we trying to build up the membership in terms of their support of what everything else we're doing as an organization? What's the overall intent of what it is we're doing? And the final point is trust relationship with any staff. If you have, whether it's volunteer staff or paid staff or part-time staff, I'll tell you something, trust relationship is critical. And some of you know I often get called in when the trust relationship is shot. And one of the things I do when I interview board members, I ask each board member, do you trust and respect the person who reports to your board? And if the answer for a near majority is no, my answer is call the lawyer because you're about to part company. It's going to be expensive, but you're about to part company. Why? Because once trust is gone, it's gone. And if you're one member short of having a majority against you, I can tell you the one member is going to fall shortly. It's gone. Trust is absolutely critical. So when you talk about full information, you talk about full disclosure, all of those things are important to the trust of an organization. How do you build a board team? How do you put people together? And again, you think, well, these things are fairly simple. I can tell you they've absolutely killed organizations time and time and time again right across Canada. These principles don't change. It doesn't matter whether I'm talking to the City of Toronto, whether I'm talking to the Alberta Gaming and Liquor Commission, or whether I'm talking to the Winfield Ag Society. All of these principles apply. It's simply principles of good governance. Respect for each other is an absolute key principle around a board table. I can understand what you're trying to say. I can figure out where you're coming from. You have a particular persuasion. Whether I agree with it or not, I believe it's valuable to this process of decision making. We have vastly different ideas, styles, and talents. We're all gifted by God separately. We all bring to the table a separate range of skills and gifts and talents. I tell people the two things that I was gifted with was writing and speaking. If you asked me to come over and help you build a rumpus room, I'd find somebody else. If Peter asked me to help him come over and program his iPad or whatever it's called, I'd be thinking of something completely different than what he actually had in mind. I'd be going back to the twit face kind of thing. But anyway, concern for different projects. You don't have to be on the same page. You want to build a board team, you can say, that's great. That's a project we need to address. If you're the chair of the board, you're going to have lots of suggestions. The question is, how do we decide what's on first base? How do we decide what's a priority for our board? Do we get whipsawed around just because somebody's louder than somebody else, which is often the case? How do we decide what's the priority? I'll come back to that. A sense of common vision? Hopefully you do, because you're a part of an organization that says, here's what we're trying to do, here's what we're designed to do, here's who we're trying to serve. We have a respect for the rules. What rules do we follow in our organization? What are the principles that we follow in terms of how we hold a board meeting? What rules do we follow in terms of how often one member can speak to the same issue? What's the rule with regard to when meetings are held? What's the rule with regard to when minutes are posted? What's the rule with regard to where they're available? What are the rules that we have in our organization that are absolutely central to who we are as an organization? So ask yourself, what Marquess of Queensberry rules governs our organization? What's the processes that we follow? One of the rules, by the way, that's often overlooked is you should have your own statement of procedures. It's called the procedural bylaw. What's our procedures for running meetings? It's really simple. Except without it, everybody's scrambling. And then somebody hauls out the Roberts rules, and somebody hauls out Bourchain's rules, and another kind of rules, and people start arguing over rules that, quite frankly, if you wrote your own that were simple, they'd apply to you. The reason other rules of order apply is because you don't have your own. Every organization should have a basic set of rules. Can the chairman speak to the issue? Does everybody vote on the issue? Do people have to declare a conflict of interest if they're involved as a staff member or if their spouse works for the organization? What if you're part of an ag society and your spouse runs the arena and the ag society is responsible for the arena? And then a desire to serve all members says that we're in this business of trying to provide good leadership to everyone. We're trying to do things as effectively and efficiently as we can. We're trying to serve all members. In doing all this, can we still end up on the wrong page? The answer is you can. I'll give you a quick example, a humorous one. Community of one. I was a long time ago, I was asked to chair a conference called the Urban Environment. And somebody said, you know, we ought to have, as one of the guest speakers, a guy named Wally Tansom from Wanham, Alberta. I'm thinking, Wally Tansom, Wanham, Alberta, small place. What would Wally have to say that would be of any value to the rest of us? And then I said, well, what does Wally do? And somebody said, well, Wally's a postmaster. And I thought, well, virtually every postmaster I've ever met has been inoculated for charisma, so that doesn't sound like it's going to be great at the conference. But anyway, they prevailed upon me and said, no, Wally's got a good message. He comes up, he walks up, and there's nothing about him in appearance that would have told me otherwise. I thought, oh, Lord. Anyway, he gets up behind the microphone and tells us the most fascinating story about community governance. He said, we as a community we made as a decision as an ag society that we were going to fund the arena committee to help build this arena. Some of you will kind of relate to that in your own communities. And so we said as a result of that we provide some funds as a grant and some funds as a loan, and we expected to be paid back by the arena committee, and they agreed to pay us back. They would do all their fundraising and the funds would be paid back. So the Ag Society was meeting in this community hall that had been built, and they're saying, what is happening to that arena committee? I mean, we've set out deadlines for payments. Deadlines have come and gone. Funds come in dribs and drabs. They don't meet their commitments. What on earth are these guys doing in our community? They're supposed to be community leaders, and they're not paying the way they should, and da-da-da-da-da. Went around the whole table. Irony of ironies, of course, is that 2 hours later, their meeting was over, and the next meeting in the same room, same building, was the arena committee. And the arena committee says, you know, what's with the Ag Society? You're putting all this pressure on us to pay up. They know we're struggling. They know we've had bake sales and a few other things, and we haven't raised the money we thought we would. We're doing our best to contribute the money. Give us a break. And then that meeting was over. And Wally noted, as did a couple of others, that between the first meeting of the Ag Society and the second meeting of the Arena Committee, nobody came and nobody left. As a result of that, this is a true story, folks. As a result of that, they formed what they called COCO, the Committee of Cooperating Organizations. And COCO brought everybody together under one roof, which in actual fact they were already. And they ended up sponsoring the zone championship for their horse plowing contest. They ended up sponsoring the regional championship. They ended up sponsoring the provincial championship. They ended up sponsoring the Canadian championship. They had more RVs than they had people in Wanham. They ended up sponsoring the World Championship. All of that was done by this small community of Wanham, Alberta, and northern Alberta. Why? Because they actually pulled their resources together. They worked as a community of interests, rather than what they were doing was simply dividing each other. You've got to ask yourself, could that happen to our organization? And in many cases, it could, quite simply. One of the points I made earlier, just to make sure I clarify this, it is now a rule in law that if you're a public organization that operates with public rules, and that applies to most of you, and you have as part of your own rules to have decisions made where your members can see you making the decisions. That you cannot make the decisions before you have a public meeting. And it is also part of law that you cannot move, therefore, the decision-making yardsticks behind closed doors. So if my point with regard to email is not the exchange of information, you can exchange information all you like back and forth. The moment you have board members saying, do I have your support on this, or don't you think we should do this in terms of our decision, is the moment you're moving the decision-making yardsticks. And the moment you're getting closer and closer to the end point, which is called the decision. And you say to yourselves, well, George, what it does do is kind of speeds up the process. Our board meetings look a lot more organized that way. We don't have all the problems at board meetings, don't have all the debate back and forth. We've already had the debate by email. It's called doing public business privately. And that's not how you ought to be doing public business. There's nothing about boards that says to me or anybody that's taught on governance that you ought to look antiseptic, that you ought to look like you got your act together in front of everybody. That's not board process, folks. There's an old adage that says anybody that likes the law, politics, or sausage should never watch any being made. And it's true. You're involved in a decision-making process that at times can get quite messy. I did a seminar for the city of Westmount, which is part of the heart of Montreal, not that long ago. And one of the council members said to me, George, we're described in the media as dysfunctional. I said, why is that? She said, because we have good arguments at our council meeting. I said, that's not dysfunctional. I've seen dysfunction. I've seen somebody get up on the table, the council table, and pour a pitcher of water over the other person's head. It's a true story. It's happened actually once in Edmonton, once in Bathurst. I'm referring to the one in Bathurst, New Brunswick. I did some work there at the time. The table collapsed. The two of them started swinging it out. One of the guys on council is a former head of the RCMP, forgot that he was 75 years of age, thought he would jump in and solve the matter. He didn't. His glasses went flying across the wall. Anyway, a whole Donnybrook breaks out. And of course, the fact that it was at an in-camera meeting means we wouldn't know anything about it. I was phoned by CBC Moncton in the morning and CBC Vancouver by lunch. So the issue got across Canada in a hurry. It was in the Globe and Mail, and they interviewed me in the Globe and Mail, and they called me what did they say? I was the highest priced marriage counselor in Canada. And they said, what do you do about this, George? And I said, well, the one thing you don't do is a personality transplant. I mean, if you've got jerks on a board, you've got jerks. I hate to tell you that, folks, but sometimes you'll end up with one. I used to teach at the Banff Center for Management, and one of the things we'd do is a mock council meeting, and I'd have counselors all primed because I told them how to act towards staff and towards the public, which was the other part of the audience, and we just kind of play it out, and they were absolutely mean-spirited, and they would be leaning back and falling asleep and sending notes back and forth, and I had people say to me, I've never seen a council act like that, and I just said, well, wait one election, because you might get somebody that does exactly what we just described. So if you've got a board of people that actually cooperate, work together, seem to like each other, overlook each other's minor personality dysfunctions, then you've probably got a decent board where you're all kind of working under the same platter. But I can tell you that not all boards function that way. So the first point is that a decision-making process should be at the table. A discussion around the issues can be done by whatever mechanism, phone calls, emails, whatever. You just need to be real cautious that you're not saying to other people on the board, do I have your support for, let's do this. You should be able to ask questions without using that kind of language. Because the moment you start, quote, ganging up and building factions on a board is the moment you're destroying the board from within. and it is highly dangerous, dysfunctional to the board. And I'll talk about other dysfunctional behaviors. Question over here.
Are you differentiating between the type of board, like some of us are on boards where there is no public meeting?
Yeah.
A director group that meets, and
Yeah.
so they share information by email before the...
If you have, the question is, well, do you differentiate between boards? And the answer would be, yes, you can. If you have a private board that's set up with a privately based organization that doesn't have outside members that require you to meet on a regular basis, then yeah, you can develop the rules of the game as you develop the rules of the game. Just make sure you've developed them in writing, because somebody will say to you, so who allowed you to make this decision? Like, I've got organizations that don't necessarily meet because of the expense, and so decisions are made between meetings. The question is, on what decisions can we make between meetings that don't interfere with the overall charter of the organization? So there are boards that don't necessarily operate publicly, and that rule wouldn't necessarily therefore apply. So the essence of leadership, I'm going to walk through these slides real quickly, but a study, by the way, I would argue that every one of you in leadership, which you are, should, besides reading Grisham on the one hand, or whoever else you read, to keep your mind sort of relaxed, you should have a governance or management or leadership book on the other side of the bed table. Read something by John Maxwell. One of his best books is one of his first ones, called The 21 Laws of Leadership. Excellent. Read something by Warren Bennett. It's a bit deeper, good stuff on leadership. The last one was called Becoming a Leader. Read something by Elizabeth Cantor, K-A-N-T-O-R. Read something by the granddaddy of them all, which is Peter Drucker. Unbelievable management mind. Died at the age of 96. I hate to tell you this, he consulted till he was 92. It's a bit of a threat there. Anyway. Warren Bennis and Bert Nanas did a study of 90 top leaders and just made a discovery about the relationship between growth and leadership. They reported that it is the capacity to develop and improve their skills that distinguishes leaders from followers. You want to be a leader in an organization, you are somebody that's constantly involved in learning. You're constantly saying, how do I improve my serve? How do I learn from the experiences of others? How do I get better at what it is I do? Some people in this room have had senior first-class leadership experience. I just had a fellow high school graduate who's in this room today come up and chat with me. He was at one time general manager of Parks and Recreation, City of Edmonton. Huge organization. Still back in the room, he's contributing as a leader in his own area of expertise in a more volunteer or smaller organization, obviously. But saying, I'm prepared to come and maybe learn or reaffirm some techniques and skills. I said to a couple of you, the most impressive student I ever had was a guy that was 6 months from retirement, came to the Banff Center for Leadership where I was teaching, and attended this whole week course. His municipality sent him, paid $2,500 or whatever it was to send him. And he said to me, I'm 6 months from retirement. I said, why would they send you? He said, well, part of it is a pat on the back for what I've done in the past. And part of it is because they want me to come back on contract and keep serving. He said, there's lots of things I've yet to learn. Part of this process of good leadership is people that can actually say, along with me, I mean, I read books all of the time. I've got leadership material going all of the time. I read a Harvard Business Review on a monthly basis, costs me good money. I read it not because the articles apply to me, but the themes do. I'm at a course yesterday morning at 7 o'clock in the morning called the Institute of Corporate Directors, and they're talking about a topic in the private sector world wherein I don't dwell, but the principles apply to what I do. And I'm listening for what are the principles these folks are talking about. It's important that you keep learning. Don't stop. The moment you stop, get off of what it is you're doing because you're done. So keep learning. Benjamin Disraeli said that to be conscious that you're ignorant of the facts is a great step towards knowledge. It's this whole process that leaders are aware of themselves. They're aware of where they're at. We all have strengths and weaknesses. We all have things we need to continue to improve on. At one time I was a boxer. I probably don't look like it now. I could barely box apples. But in any case, Joe Frazier was one of my heroes in the days of Muhammad Ali and Frazier and some of the great fights they had. Said you can map out a fight plan, but when the fight starts, you're down to your reflexes. That's where the road work shows. If you cheated in the dark of the morning, in other words, didn't go out and work out, you'll be found out under the bright lights. It's this whole issue of preparation. You want to demoralize the board you're on, walk into the boardroom with your agenda package under your arm unopened. That is a definition of instant expert. It's somebody that opens the agenda package on their way into the room and presumes to start making good decisions. You can't do it, folks. Next. Leadership is about influence. One of the textbooks we had back in the days of the University of Alberta program that I was in was a book by Harry Overstreet called The Mature Mind. And one of the points he said, the very essence of all power to influence lies in getting the other person to participate. You cannot be a leader without having folks working with you, and they're working with you because they appreciate your leadership. They appreciate where you're taking the organization. They're prepared to follow you. If you have to operate as a boss and command respect, you're not functioning as a leader. Leaders have people following them because they believe in where you're going and they're prepared to come along and walk with you. That's good leadership. Next. One of my great quotes, the quote by Norman Schwarzkopf, he of Gulf War fame, 1991, said that leadership is a potent combination of strategy and character. If you must be without one, be without strategy. Said one of the best strategic leaders of all time. Somebody that understood the need for strategy. Underlying all of this, folks, is character. Leaders provide the impetus for a movement. That's why leadership is important. We have all kinds of folks that are prepared to join organizations providing that someone's moving it. Someone's taking it and moving the yardsticks forward. Somebody's got a sense of where does the future lie. Leaders possess characteristics which enable others to follow the course. They're people of integrity, vision, and perseverance. They don't give up easily. They move forward readily. They're passionate about what the organization has done and can do, and they're successful at convincing others to join the cause. Leaders are people that are in every organization, sometimes, by the way, not in leadership roles, which is ironic, but are in every organization, and they're absolutely passionate about what the organization can do, is doing, and will do in the future. And the moment you're in an organization and you quit thinking future, you quit thinking what's our next challenge, is the moment you ought to be talking to yourself into retirement. I mean, one of the reasons I stepped down after 4 terms as mayor in Spruce Grove and had been involved in other organizations is I did not have the same zeal for doing what I used to do. I couldn't look forward to another 3-year term and say, boy, I'm excited about that. Just wasn't there. You need to be able to say to yourself and your organization, if I'm not there, somebody else with a whole set of new ideas is going to come in and help lead that organization. Part of your job as leaders is to provide for succession planning, is to provide for other folks to follow you into the organization. So how am I doing that? How am I attracting and mentoring others? Keys to being an effective leader: understand the need for role clarity. This whole idea of what does a leader do versus those that are involved in the organization as either staff or volunteer workers. Leaders see beyond. They possess a vision to move members. I've talked about that. Recognize that it's they who are accountable. Interesting. Vote against it all you want. The moment it's made, you own it. And in particular, your chairman speaks it. The chairman doesn't even have a choice. The chairman walks out of a room and says, we decided. Not against my best wishes. It's simply, we decided. It's called democracy, which most of us like until the vote goes against us. We focus on the primary client. We understand who is it that we're trying to serve in this organization. You want to screw up an organization, forget who it is you serve. Start to think about others. Like, are you serving the government or are you serving the members? Are you serving the media or are you serving the members? What is your role in the organization? Who are we trying to appeal to in terms of our membership base? Why is it not growing? Is it because we're not focused on them? Because we're not encouraging other people to come alongside? Leaders are resilient. They bend on issues and not principles. I talked about that, and they sense the need for maturity in decision-making, which is in part why you're here, is to say, how do we mature our decision-making processes in our organization? How do we get better at what it is we do? So just in terms of types of organizations that the Alberta Ag Society has actually sent out messages like this to and has tried to be in touch with, what kind of organizations exist? There's a variety of cooperatives. Some of you here mentioned you belong to a gas co-op. There's agricultural societies that are, I don't know how many across Alberta. 295 agricultural societies. That's almost the same number as municipalities, by the way, of which there are about 310. Charities, there's all kinds of charities that have charitable donation status or just called charities. Service clubs, every community has a variety of service clubs. Lions Club, Kinsman Club, service clubs. Not-for-profit organizations that have this goal of saving humanity, saving the river valley, saving the whatever, and it was a not-for-profit, people put time and effort into it, they contribute to the cost of it, but nobody's taking money out of it. Children's authorities, there are 9 of those across Alberta. Edmonton's got one called the Edmonton FCSA, which is the Child and Family Services Agency. There's 9 of those. There used to be 9 health regions. It's paralleled under the same structure. Part 9 companies, I think of one up in Bonnyville that runs the arena facility there, which is comprised of 2 or 3 municipalities that agree to serve on the board of a Part 9 company. There are rural utilities that provide exactly what it says, utilities out in rural areas that perhaps major gas or power utility companies aren't interested in serving or haven't historically served. Some of them are now getting quite interested in putting service into those areas because they realize there's money to be made. So rural utilities have an ongoing battle between themselves and companies like ATCO and so on. Police commissions are another kind of organization that you have one here in the city of Edmonton. You have one, I'm not sure out here because this is an RCMP area, but wherever there's a local police department, of which there's about 8 or 10 in Alberta, you'd have a police commission. And Crown corporations, there's about 230 Crown corporations in Alberta. I surveyed, I think, just about all of them for the Auditor General's Department. I looked at how do they recruit CEOs, how do they evaluate CEOs, how do they pay CEOs. Interesting process, by the way. There's a ton of money spent in the province of Alberta through Crown corporations that you might never see. One of the biggest ones, by the way, has a revenue of $23 billion a year. Which one is it? Sorry? Alberta Gaming and Liquor Commission. Contributes $6 to $8 billion a year to the provincial bottom line. Interesting. Synopsis of key roles, we're going to talk about that. Board, chair, executive, and staff. Not all of you will have these same things in your organization. Fill in the blanks because some of you will have bits and pieces of all of it, I suspect. What's the role of the chair? Because of the breadth of organizations in the room, you have to decide how does this apply to us. You have to decide how do we make this work. Barry Anderson is here with me. Barry and I had a university professor by the name of Al Affleck, who's a great old wise guy in the right sense of the word, who's still alive today, 89 years of age. He's at a senior's home. He wrote an article called QUID, Q-U-I-D, with an asterisk beside it, which means you've got to go to the bottom of the page to see what the word at the top of the page means. And at the bottom of the page is the definition for the word quid, Q-U-I-D, and it says something to be chewed but not necessarily swallowed. That's what I deliver. I deliver based on what I have experienced over the last 35 years in organizations like yours. I deliver on what I think works. Does it apply to you? I think the principles do. Do you have exactly the same structure as what I might describe? Maybe not. But I can tell you that some of the real basics apply. So the fact that you need to get people to understand roles is absolutely paramount. Don't presume people know simply because of a title. Because titles convey to somebody something completely contrary to what you think it conveys. You had better describe in at least a paragraph or two what is the role of the president or chair, the role of the vice chair, the role of the executive, the role of the treasurer, and so on. Make sure you know what the role is. And then ask yourself, do we have the appropriate policies, what I call governance policies, to guide these roles? So in addition to roles, chapter number 2 would be governance policy. What is it that we are entitled to do as an organization? What is it this executive can do as an organization? What gives us the credibility, the clout to act as we act? One of the discoveries that I made when I just finished this review for Strathcona County, and the question, as some of you will recall, was this whole issue of the council member that got his BlackBerry pulled and his computer pulled by the chief commissioner because he supposedly had abused it in a variety of ways, which it turns out he did. The question is, who has authority to make what decisions? And the answer at the end of the day was Strathcona County, which is one of the more sophisticated counties in Alberta, if not Canada, does not have governance policy, as they should, in my opinion, to govern what a council can do. So if you're issued county-owned BlackBerries and cell phones, can you use them for private business? Can you run your business while you're sitting at a council meeting on your BlackBerry? I mean, you think to yourself, that's pretty evident, that shouldn't be allowed. Where does it say that? Well, it says that in the Code of Ethics. So I read the Code of Ethics, and the Code of Ethics absolutely applies to the administration. It says what the county commissioner, the CAO, is allowed to do if staff act in a bad way, if they misuse their equipment. You notice the way I didn't say the word mayor, I didn't say the word councillor, I said staff. These are policies applied to the administration. They got all kinds of them. The same policies don't necessarily apply to the leadership of the organization. So my statement to you is, don't rely on having a job description for the executive director of the Chamber of Commerce. I want to know what's the job description for the executive and for the board. What's the job description? What are you entitled to do? What do you hang your hat in terms of your power for decision making? If you say we have a code of conduct, where's the policy that adopts that code of conduct? If you say we have policies around how soon minutes are produced and distributed, what's your policy? Where's that? And people start describing it to me and they say, well, we do this and we do that. And I say, that sounds like past practice. It doesn't sound like policy. Policy is actually created. Policy addresses the question of what do we do? Procedure is addressed to how do we do it? Once you've gone past about the first paragraph when you're describing policy, I start to get a bit nervous because my guess is you're already into procedure, and the answer is in most cases you are. And I've reviewed a ton of these, and I've taught it a ton of times. If you're setting policy, ask yourself, what's the what question? That's policy. So chapter 2 of this structure that I'm devising would have governance policy written all over it. They would be refined, they would be reviewed by your board, and they would be re-stamped by your board saying these are applicable to the 2011 term. That's what should happen. A third chapter, and I'll describe other chapters later, but a third chapter in this composite view of a well-run organization would be called priorities, would be called future orientation. Let's just call them governance priorities. What do we as the governing body think ought to be done over the next 12 to 18 months? You know what is in most of those governance priority chapters in the organizations I review? Nothing. You know what they do? They go to meeting after meeting after meeting and get overwhelmed by all the issues on the agenda without ever once stepping back and saying, so what does this say about our priorities? And you get so buried in the administrivia, you get so buried in the day-to-day minutiae that you lose sight of this bigger picture. Remember I talked about leaders earlier as being people focused on the big picture. So where is this focus that you have? And the focus needs to be around what are the priorities that we are setting as an organization. A fourth part of this process is called structure. Who do we need to do what in our organization? Do we have enough of them? How do we do that? It's called organization design. It's really, I mean, you can write books and people have on this one topic, but the organization design is what resources do we need to accomplish what it is we're set out to do? So is that clear? Is that defined? Is it well orchestrated? Do we understand who's needed? Do we review that to see whether or not different jobs are required? And again, organizations go along like yours, and you're so busy going to the next meeting, so busy approving the financials for that month, that you don't look up from the paper to say, where are we heading from here? We read our agenda package at home, if you get one. You come to the next meeting and you put your hands up. So where's the leadership? Where are you going? When do you step back and say, what are the top 3 things that impact us? What do we want to change? It's like people with their head down. I remember when I was mayor, one of the big issues early on was the design and development of Highway 16. You folks don't recall when we just had Highway 16, now called Highway 16A, going down Stony Plain Road right out to Jasper. I can tell you at one stage we actually had somebody, who was actually a former mayor of ours, who was part of the planning process for Alberta Transportation, saying, George, we're designing a whole new highway. It's going to bypass Spruce Grove. It's going to be on your north end. And it's going to take away all the truck traffic that's currently coming down your main road. And you say, oh, hallelujah, that's great. Is it? Well, I can tell you it impacts every business up and down the highway in Spruce Grove, which is called our downtown, which is an inadequate downtown compared to a lot of others, but that's how it was designed. So we sat down with them and said, you can't be doing that. You can't be building this whole new highway and rerouting all the traffic without impacting negatively our downtown. What are we doing to change that? And we need a couple of decisions that we ended up having implemented by Alberta Transportation. One of them was that if you come in from Jasper, just ask yourself the next time you're driving in from Jasper, just look for the sign that says Highway 16A with an arrow off to the right. Spruce Grove Stony Plain is on that same sign, and right below it, it says West Edmonton Mall. You know why it's on there? Because we want traffic going like this through our downtown to get to West Edmonton Mall, that's why. Where's the main attraction from people coming in, other than the truckers who don't want to come downtown? West Edmonton Mall. You know who contributed to that? Our council did. You know how many local businesses did? They didn't. We asked them. They didn't get involved in the process because they're focused on the cash register. And the cash register hadn't quit ringing. It's too late when it stops. Somebody's got to be thinking down the road, how is this going to impact the rest of us? And that's called you. You've got to be asking yourself, what is the future of our organization? Is there a future to the Ag Society we're a part of? Is there a future to the REA we're a part of? Is there a future to the cultural organization, the Eco Country, the whatever it is? What's the future look like for us? And I would argue that organizations that don't have some sense of where this is are organizations that are going to shrivel and die because they haven't addressed future challenges. You know what I'd be interested in being a part of would be a discussion around a Legion table. Where are we going from here? I can tell you that in this past year, the last survivor who fought in World War I died. So if my membership is coming from that group, they're done. Now I got a reducing membership coming from World War II and from the Korean War and so on. What are we doing in terms of the future of the organization? It's called succession planning. What are we doing as old folks in our organizations, whether it's a church or a community group or whatever it is, to attract younger people in? Because that's the future of where we're going to be. You know, what really disturbs me as a former politician is hearing people badmouth politicians. Like I go in every year faithfully to the school to talk about, on local government week, to talk about the value of being a mayor. I set up a little mock council meeting and all that kind of stuff, have a little presentation. Why? Because I want these kids to go home and say, we had the former mayor in here. He was mayor when we became a city. It was a big deal. We ran through a council meeting. Oh, it was interesting. Politics comes alive. And they're going to go home kind of enthused by that. And hopefully they're going to say, this is where it's at. These people make decisions impacting our lives. Now I ask you as a group, who do you want making decisions for you 20 years from now when you're looking for your seniors check? Not quite some of your cases, but the rest of us were already there. I can tell you, I want kids that I helped influence. I want young people to have the right values. I don't want to be telling them politics is terrible. I can tell you that one day I was George Cuff, and the next day my neighbor said, good morning, Mr. Mayor. I hadn't changed one iota, other than it was a little factor called an election the night before. It was amazing, by the way. I was a mayor for 12 years. It took me a long time to get my wife to call me Your Worship.
Maybe she didn't vote for you.
It wasn't. It wasn't nearly as long to get her to come to your wash-up when I was done, but anyway. So that had nothing to do with whatever's up on the slide, but anyway, a little bit of encouragement. I'm just absolutely passionate about the need for people to apply themselves, with the gifts and talents they have, to building their community in a way that's constructive today and helpful for the future. And there's all kinds of challenges in doing that. I'm not unmindful of that. You don't have enough money, you don't have the right facilities, you don't have enough young people coming alongside. You got all these challenges. That's what they are. They're challenges. They're not totally impediments, they're challenges. How do we get folks coming alongside us? How do we get influential others helping us? All those things are part of your challenge. If you're doing good work and you've got a good organization, it's worth preserving. That's my attitude. If it's worthwhile folding up because nobody's interested, fold it up, call it a day, celebrate, have a party, thank everybody, and we're done. You say, we can't do that. Well, if you can't do that, then decide how are you going to either partner with others, how are you going to lead effectively, how are you going to make use of the resources you have. I remember doing a review in Central Alberta of the Hall Board, which came up on one of your tables. It's interesting. I was reviewing the municipality, which was essentially broke, but one of the issues became the Hall Board. And I said, well, how does this become the Hall Board? They said, well, we had a Hall Committee. So how to become a Hall Board? Well, they came into us one council meeting and said, we're now a Hall Board, so we can apply for money out of lotteries funding. Well, that's interesting. So how did they become a Hall Board without you endorsing them? We're not sure, they said. So what they did, though, is they asked the Hall Committee for the money that they had collected so far before they became a Hall Board, and the Hall Board said, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to keep the money because we need that to run the Hall Board. Oh. So they demanded back and forth, and it ended up becoming a legal issue. The money, which was about $7,000, was never discovered. It kind of went by way of the way of the dodo bird. So anyway, when I was doing my review, I sat down with this one person, true story, I sat down with this one lady, and I said, so you're on the Hall Board, along with being on Town Council, were you? Yeah. I can tell you why that's all wrong, by the way. But anyway, so I said, as I understand it, some funds went missing. And she agreed, the funds went missing. They were there, they went missing. I said, so you were at the time, you were the president of the organization. She said, yeah, that's right. I said, so the funds went missing and you're telling me you don't know where they went? And she kind of looked at me like, are you Inspector Clouseau or what? Anyway. So I said, I'm just curious. I said, signatures, checks require 2 signatures, president and one other. The one other typically is the treasurer. I said, so how would that have happened? She said, is this going in your report? I said, no, because the issue is essentially done with. I'm just curious. So she said, well, what happened is that the treasurer came over to the house with some blank checks and said, we need these signed because we have certain expenditures to make. And you're feeling sick, Madam President, so just sign these 2 checks or 3 checks. We'll make sure the business gets done while you're kind of on time off. Right, says the president, foolishly. And the treasurer got the checks signed, blank checks. And within weeks, $7,000 took flight. So I said, well, that's an interesting story, right? Why wouldn't you have told the town council about it? Why wouldn't you have informed the police about it? And the answer was, the treasurer is my mother. So if you say to me, I mean, so what does that say in my mind, besides being illegal and should never have happened and all those things? It talks to me about conflict of interest. It talks to me who ought not to serve on the same body. It talks to me who ought not have signatures on the same checks. It talks to me about the problem with family relationships and organizations. It talks to me about why a town councillor should not be a president of another organization, which, by the way, they shouldn't. Nobody on town council should be the president of any of your groups and organizations or county council, and yet some of them are. Why shouldn't they be? Because they have a piece of legislation that says they're supposed to act in the best interests of all citizens. You can't act in the best interests of all citizens if your focus is around one particular board or agency like this. I can tell you, you are conflicted. It never works. Yes?
Do councils have the right to appoint councillors
only if they've created it or it's created by legislation. For example, the Libraries Board is created by legislation, and there's a requirement to have a councillor appointed to the Libraries Board.
Legislation of the Alberta government?
Yes, Alberta government. You can find that under the Libraries Act. But most organizations are there that have been created at one point or another by council, and some have council representation because they came to council and said, gee, it'd be great if one of you sat on our executive or sat on our board. And I say to councillors, don't do it. Any of these issues that are going to deal with your community are going to come to your council regardless, so why do you need to serve on something else? Oh, because they asked. It's a lousy reason. Because you become conflicted real quickly. I'll give you a quick example. This is a little bit off topic, but it's interesting because it's parallel. Niagara-on-the-Lake, I did a review of it. They had a Parks Commission. They also had a Tree Committee. So I asked them, why not have a Branch Committee? So the Tree Committee had 3 members of the council, 2 members of the public, and they had access to a horticulturalist from the Niagara School of Horticulture. They'd walk down the main street together, one of the prettiest communities in all of Canada, and the horticulturist would say, see that elm tree? And they'd all look up and say, yeah. See that dark spot? Yes. Well, that's Dutch elm disease. Ooh. One of the members would say, what should we do? And the horticulturist would say, well, we should clip it out. Ooh. You can just see the value, can't you? I couldn't either. Parkland County had at one time the Culvert Committee. I can see you're impressed. The Culvert Committee was all members of council. They'd hop on the truck with the public works foreman, drive down the main road, come to an intersection, and the foreman would say, we've had problems at this intersection with the culvert. So all the councillors would get out of the van, get down to the ditch. It's plugged. It's plugged. 9 people get back up in the van and start driving to the next one. Somebody would say as they're driving along, what do you think we ought to do? And the answer was, see, you should have been on the committee. Unplug it. If you're going to do something, folks, it needs to add value. So what's the value added in terms of your organization? What are you doing that's distinct, that's unique, that's important? This talks about the role of the chair and says one of the things the chair does is actually chair the meetings, chairmanship function. What that says to me is that a chairman will know the agenda better than anybody else. Chairman and the clerk of the organization. They talk about it, they talk about what's going on the agenda, why are these items on the agenda, what are we trying to accomplish, so the chairman knows how to steer a debate. Chairman also has a role in team building, which is drawing members together. All of us represent different interests, different things that excite us. How do we get everybody on the same page? The chair's role, and underline this one, is the advocate of councils or the board or whatever it is in your case, agenda. What does that mean? It means that the chair can have their own point of view, can express it during the course of the meeting, and the moment that the board or the council makes a decision, the chair says, that's our decision. The chair's voice has gone mute with regard to any other opinions the chair ever had on any other issue. On that particular issue, the chair is guided by the body called the board or the membership. So whatever you place in the hands of the board and say, what's your decision? The chairman's job is to stand up and say, here's the decision. Chairman's often the initial point of contact for anybody. The chairman's the public spokesperson. Any issues with regard to that body should be voiced by the chair to the media, to the council that you're dealing with. And the chair should be the conduit of decisions to shareholders, stakeholders, anybody else. Yes? Is the chair always the president? And the answer is, generally speaking, I would say 9 times out of 10, yes. It's not required unless it is required by your constitution. And often constitutions will say the president will also chair the meetings. Does that always make sense? In some cases, no, because sometimes presidents who are good at leading aren't necessarily good at chairing. 2 separate functions. I would say in most cases, presidents are in fact chairs. So you need to have some understanding of what meeting protocol looks like. And by the way, meeting protocol is what I talked about earlier under procedural bylaw and so on. You need a set of protocols that guide your meetings. What does a meeting look like? What's intended to happen at a meeting? Who functions happen at a meeting? All of that should be done by a meeting protocol which you approve by policy. So the chair can effectively guide the meeting. For example, if you have a board of 7 members, do you need a seconder on your motions? The answer is you don't. All you need to do is pass one motion that's seconded, by the way, ironically, that says we no longer need seconders. Purpose of seconders is to prove that in a crowd of 7, you got 2 people that think the same way. Now, if you've got a board like I did of 67, it's important to have a seconder. If you can't get one other person to agree with you, you're in trouble anyway, so why waste time? That's the purpose. So what's your procedure? Question over here.
In your AGM meetings, usually the crowd demands a chair from the crowd.
Yeah, at an annual general meeting, sometimes the crowd demands that we appoint a chairman from the audience. It's something I'm particularly not in favor of, because often what that means is we're about to stage a palace revolt and we want one of our own people to help lead the revolt. I think that's dangerous, to be quite frank. And so I would, if I were creating a new organization, I'd have rules with regard to the annual general meeting, and it would say that the chair will be as designated by the board of directors. If you can't trust your board of directors to chair a meeting, you've got the wrong board of directors. And yeah, sometimes somebody in the crowd could be a more effective chair. Who knows? And sometimes the board of directors may say, we got a better chair that's in the audience. Let's have that person chair this meeting. Sometimes that can happen. Where does it most happen is when there's a really strong issue on the table and people in the audience think that the board is going the wrong direction. Generally speaking, then they'll want their own independent chair. I mean, I've been brought into meetings where I'm asked to be the chair because everybody's fighting everybody else. One that I did for Alberta Agriculture up in Manning comes to mind, where you had 2 major factions bashing each other. They needed somebody that looked like the meat and the sandwich, and I look like that. Roles of the board, one is leadership. These are boiled down roles, but key roles, critical and common to every board. Board's role is leadership, which is setting the vision out, setting the priorities, resolving disputes. Whether you like it or not, that's part of being a board. Decision making, which talks about what process do we use, do we get access to good information, and member participation. How do we get people involved in the board as members? We ensure open door communication. We provide access. You want to destroy an organization, by the way, restrict information. Give members a sense that you're hiding behind closed doors. It will quickly destroy the organization you're part of. You want to build organization loyalty and allegiance, get minutes out immediately. Get information out immediately. Don't gild the lily. Make sure you've got information that's clear, that's comprehensive, everybody can get their hands on. The moment people suspect that you as a board are doing things behind closed doors that they as the members are not aware of is the moment they lose trust in the board. And having just come out of this situation up in Manning with the rural electrification, board was destroyed from within. And by the time we were brought in, it was absolute. I said to one of the senior people from Alberta Agriculture, I said, this whole thing could be summed up in 2 words. It's called board confidence. And the fact that there was none meant that this process was going to unravel in a hurry, and it did. It's tragic because you had volunteers serving this membership. They're trying to do the best thing they could. Meanwhile, they're doing it behind closed doors. The membership lost faith. You can't do that. So as boring as you might think your minutes are, get them in front of everybody. As unimportant as you think your meeting was, don't try to hide it from anybody. And if you've got a critical issue on which you're divided, tell people you're divided. Tell people this is a big issue and you're going to take it up again at the next meeting. They want to weigh in on it, they can weigh in on it. You're there to guard resources, which means setting the policies, monitoring those policies, and when you have an auditor involved, which some of you do, you either audit from within, presumably, or you have an outside auditor come in. You meet with the auditor and you don't have your eyes glossed over because you don't understand finance. You say to the auditor, put it in the vernacular. I need to understand this because we're going to talk about this at the annual general meeting. The auditor's job is to make those statements come alive so you actually understand what's being said. What's the change this year over last year? What processes are we following that you don't agree with as an auditor? What things can we do to improve our checks and balances? If they'd have asked those questions at the MD of Bighorn, which is located out by Canmore, they might not have seen $3.8 million float out the window. But they did. Nobody asked the question. They had all these investment funds. Nobody on council in that particular community said, where are those investment funds invested? If they'd have asked, they might have found out they weren't properly invested according to Alberta law, and as a result of it, they all went poof. It was the only case in Canadian history where the chief administrative officer was charged with negligence successfully. Never asked the questions. Council's dismissed. In the case of Kitchener, Ontario, organization comes in and says, you know that $50 million recreation center, we can build it for $28 million. Oh, it's too good to be true. Did you hear those words? The moment you hear the words, it's too good to be true, you ought to ask yourself what you just said. And it was too good to be true. If they looked at the fine print, it was $252 million. Council gone, senior staff gone. Why? Because trust is gone. You didn't provide oversight. You didn't ask questions. It's part of the deal. Policy leadership says, what are the key issues and what's our stance on those issues? The other thing I'd say to you about policy is it should be around two basic principles with regard to policy. Where do we set policy? You set policy if the issue is major, i.e., for example, do we buy up private land to increase the River Valley Sanctuary? It's a policy. Do we or do we not? Do we sell publicly deeded land to a private interest? That's a policy statement of an organization. Why? Because it's major. It talks about our very base. The second thing that it should be for a policy, either or, is repetitive. Is the issue going to come up again on our agenda? If the answer is yes, then what's your policy? Our policy is we do thus and so with regard to sending members to conferences like this. Our issue is that we pay for the membership cost or the registration cost. Is that the policy? Or is the policy whatever you go to, you take out of your own pocket? See, what's the policy of your organization? Now, before you rush back and submit a claim, you should find out what the policy is. What's expected of board members? I'll run through these fairly quickly. This is what every board member should have going in. One is a willingness to recognize this is different. Somebody said to me over the lunch hour, I'm involved as a local businessman, and this is a challenge. This is different. And you're right, it is. It's a whole other process that you may never have been exposed to. Some of you have been on all kinds of boards and committees, and a lot of it starts to become, quote, humdrum. My guess is it doesn't, but it might. The processes do. We've got somebody in the audience that served on a major health authority board, served on a county council board, there are a variety of things. Has an immense background of skills into now an ag society. Has a full understanding. Does it all apply to an ag society? Actually, the principles all do. Right, George? A desire to provide effective leadership to their administration, clients, and members. A board says we are in the business of leading, and that's what we're going to do. We take inputs from all sources, but we're in the business of leading. A board has an understanding that governing bodies and administrations are two distinct components. We're not here in a fight against our own people. And I deal with boards all the time where the biggest disagreement is with the staff working for the board. It's amazing. Like, how can that happen? It simply says to me, you're not dialoguing, you're not getting together and talking to each other. And pretty soon you go like this. I mean, the marriage example comes to mind real quick. How do they get destroyed? They implode from within. Why? Because people quit communicating, or they communicate quite differently and don't understand it until they're too late in the game. Respect for the distinctiveness of each role, respect and trying to avoid overlap. I'm not staff. Even if I'm volunteering on the weekend as staff, my role when I'm sitting at the board table is providing leadership to those issues. Say I'm an Ag Society board member. I provide guidance. We're going to have farmers market as a policy 10 times a year in our community. That's our policy. It's repetitive and it's significant policy. What's our policy? We have farmers markets 10 times a year. I'm now over here on Saturday morning, and what am I doing? I'm running one of the booths at the farmers market. What am I doing? I'm taking tickets at the door, or I'm handing out refreshments. I'm now acting as a volunteer staff member for that same function. The challenge for that kind of organization is how do I keep these two roles separate? The challenge for the organization like the Chamber of Commerce that actually has a staff member doing some of this is how do I stay out of this person's hip pocket? How do I quit trying to be him or her? It's a huge challenge. And it's the clash between those two that causes a whole lot of dust-ups at organizations. Probably not yours, because you probably got it all figured out. And its high level of integrity says we come in as servants. We come in recognizing that we do not conflict our private business with this public business. We don't presume that this organization is going to buy the lumber from me because I run the lumber hardware. They can go somewhere else. And the moment you're conflicted, by the way, just look yourself in the mirror first thing in the morning after you shower. I know it's a scary thought, but ask yourself, am I in conflict on this agenda tonight or this afternoon? And if there's anything on that agenda that conflicts with you, you'll know it in a second. Am I in conflict? Is my public hat in contrast to my private hat? If it is, declare the conflict and get away from the table and step out of the room. Don't sit at the back of the room and watch the meeting. Get out of the room. Why? Because it's been proven that your presence conflicts the rest of the people at the table. And now in law for municipalities, you're not allowed to stay in the room. So am I in conflict? The answer is if you're trying to sell goods or services to the organization you're serving on the board of, you're in conflict. Your duty should be a common duty to all of the members that you have. When the moment hits that your duty, your function, your interest is no longer common, is the moment you're in conflict of interest. Sorry.
So if there is someone who there's a conflict of interest issue and that person has not declared it to step back, what is the process for dealing with that?
That's a good question. People say that's a good question when they don't know the answer. But anyway, the question is, what happens if the person is in conflict but doesn't step back from the table? I can tell you that if it was a local government, you could end up having the person taken to the Court of Queen's Bench and dismissed off the council. If it's an organization like most of yours, which is a sometimes public organization which runs under a somewhat looser set of rules, the answer is it's the persuasion of the board to say, Sally, we're in the business of encouraging wine growing and da-da-da-da-da, and you happen to be one of the principal makers and you're here trying to sell us on this concept. You're in conflict on that concept. Your job is to simply step back and out of the room. We'll discuss it. We'll come back to you and tell you what we decided, but you're in conflict. The person doesn't dissent, doesn't take themselves out of the room. In my mind, you then have a question of, do we as a board stop the proceedings, call a recess and talk to the member, which is one of your options, or do we adjourn the meeting and sort of have this issue taken up at the next meeting, or do we pass a motion of censure against our board member? And beyond that, your options are pretty limited. Over here.
So if that board member removes himself from the room, the board can still do business with that person?
Yeah, the fact that you happen to have a business that is being dealt with by the board is not the conflict. The conflict is where you fail to declare it. So you can still have a business with the board and still be on the board for every other item on the agenda. Just on that issue, you have to make sure you remove yourself from the discussion, leading up to the vote, from the vote, and from the room. So people used to say, no, I'll discuss it, I'll help you understand the issue, and then I'll not vote. It doesn't work that way, folks. A, don't discuss. B, don't vote. And C, step out of the room. Over here.
How far does it go with relatives like niece or...
Well, and the law now says that the relative is defined as somebody you are either in a common law relationship with or are married to, or somebody that you have as a child and offspring, either immediate or through your spouse, i.e. a blended marriage. But that brothers, sisters, nieces, nephews don't count as conflict. Now, if I were in such an organization, I'd say, what's the perception? Because I can guarantee you perception becomes reality. And if the perception is me having my nephew who's the one that's trying to sell us land, sell us the building, I'd be out of the room. Why? Because you don't want to taint the decision-making process, and therefore you're going to rely on your colleagues at the table to make a good decision without you sitting there. And there's lots of organizations, folks, that are conflicted all of the time. For example, people have children with disabilities, serve on what's called Persons with Developmental Disabilities boards across Alberta. There's, I think, 9 of them. My question would be, how do you serve on a board if you have a child that's impacted by funding and so on, and you're arguing for more funding for that kind of disability? I mean, you're immediately conflicted. The principle of good governance says we remove ourselves from conflict. We take a at common issue. We vote at common with others. So somebody says, how does a municipal council set taxes? Because after all, it impacts their own pocketbook. The answer is it's at common with everybody else. You recognize the need for orientation, respect the ideas of others. I've talked about that. Be willing to be agents of change. Let me stop at the last point. You want to have a good, effective board? You want to be a good, effective board member? Ask questions. There's a great quote, for those of you that like quotes, that says, one can lead with no more than a question in hand. It's a great quote. One can lead with no more than a question at hand. What it says is, this lady over here, I can't remember your first name, Tanya? Tanya asking me the question, focus the minds of every one of us on that issue. Why? Because she asked the question. You want to lead in a community organization? When the issue comes up on the table, ask the question. How does this coincide with our priorities? Boy, that's a great governance question. How does this potentially going to impact our overall budget or our fundraising or our membership or whatever it is? That's governance questions. Do we buy the lumber at Home Hardware versus McLeod's? That's administrivia. Why? Because we're grinding down into the bowels of the organization and talking about, does the executive director of the chamber over here buy his stationery at Staples or does he buy it at home, whatever, The pure administrivia. If you got time for that, you don't have enough on your agenda. Next. Hallmarks of a successful board, I think I've talked about most of this, but being prepared to learn, being a servant of the members. Like if you don't have this notion in your mind by now that your job is to help serve others, you kind of like leadership but you don't like serving, you're in the wrong business. I mean, can you think of anything more ridiculous than a county councillor or a town councillor going door to door and saying, elect me for the next 3 years so you can beat up on me? But that's effectively what people do. Elect me for the next 3 years, right, Peter? So you can criticize me for the next 3 years. Several of you have been on councils. You know that that's the truth. That's what you're doing. You're saying, elect me so I can serve you. And it's true. That's what we do. Whether you're in a church board, which should be all around service and servanthood, or you're in a community service club or whatever it is, ag society, you're a part of service. And if you don't like the idea of serving others, then you're in the wrong business entirely. This is part of our challenge. It's when egos get in the way and you start seeing yourself larger than life, when this becomes a real problem. And sometimes, by the way, that's when people stay too long. They start owning the mechanism. And the moment you quit asking questions is because you think to yourself, if that was a good question, I'd have asked it 10 years ago. Like, I'm absolutely in favor of a tenure clause in every organization. And some of you will argue with me and say, oh, no, the only way you've kept people is because they're still here. They're still around. They've been around for 15 years. We hope we keep them for 20. Well, in some cases that might make sense. In most cases it doesn't. You're simply stopping new people from joining. You're not creating vacancies like you should. I would say 2 terms, 3 years each, 6 years, you're done. Step off for 1 year, come back at it again if you like. If not, serve on something else. Spread your gifts and talents around. But I have a sunset clause. You know what happens if you don't? You have 7 members out of 9 who have all been around for 15 years. They don't want to do anything new. They don't want to challenge any decision. And everything that's ever happened in the past, fine by me. There's no sense of new ideas, new constructs. Yes?
How do you encourage people to get off the board they've been on for some time?
Yeah, that's a great question. How do we encourage people to step back if they've been on there for, because they don't have on their forehead, they don't have past due date or whatever, Some of them have Grand Poobah on their forehead. But anyway, the great potentate. I think you end up talking around once a year, what are the kind of key policies by which we're guided? And there ought to be a policy around board member tenure. What is the policy that guides our board members? There's a whole series of those in terms of board member selection, board member skill set, board member tenure, board member compensation. All of those things should be covered by policy. But tenure is an important issue because otherwise people come, they like it, they stay, become second family. And the problem with that is they start to adopt it as family, they start to own it, they start to own the decision making, and they think that if you ever want it to change, it's like heresy. And therein lies the problem. You get roadblocks rather than people are saying, let's get at it, let's get some new stuff going. I think change in leadership is absolutely ideal, to be quite frank, and the longer you stay, you've got to ask yourself, am I still adding new ideas? And I can tell you there are exceptions to the rule. So I'm not about to say that somebody that's been on for 15 years isn't adding value. That's up to the person and the board to decide. So I always had great admiration for Ron Hayter in Edmonton, because he always approached issues like it sounded new to him. His words sounded like, I'm challenging this stuff. Hazel McCallion and Mayor of Mississauga, 89 years of age. I think that's past the due date, but in any case, Hazel also had the ability to make things sound new. I just fear that there's not very many of those kinds of people, and unfortunately they start to populate boards and they become the absolute woodwork of the board and nothing gets past them. With respect to the point being made, I think we could do thus and so and still encompass that point. With respect to da-da-da-da-da, I think we could do this. Although I don't want to disagree loudly with this particular position, I think we could do it this way. I mean, there's a variety of ways to address issues without causing offense. Just don't look at the person and say, you jerk, whatever gave you that impression. Or what tease, where were you at last night? All that kind of stuff. Don't question their heritage, for example. Need to be well prepared but open to the ideas of others. So, come in prepared. Come in thoughtful. Don't park your brains at the door on the way in. Come in and discuss, think. Understand democracy and prepared to ask the dumb question. That's the point I said about Drucker earlier on. Understands teamwork. Groupthink is this process where one person says something, this is a simple definition, and everybody jumps on board and says it must be right. That's groupthink. Everybody parks their brains. So the loudest person says, this is what we ought to do, and everybody goes, I guess that sounds all right. See, it's lousy. It's like having committees, right? Remember, your boards and agencies have committees. So the finance committee comes in and says, we ought to do thus and so with regard to the budget, and everybody goes, I guess that's all right. I mean, you find yourself doing that, folks. You're not there to wave at people. You're there to make decisions. When you put a hand up, it should be straight up, like I'm in favor. Why? Because I challenge this. I think it's right. I think we ought to do it. Now, do you sit because somebody is off in a committee and comes in and says we ought to do it? Does that make it the gospel? It doesn't, actually. It means they met, they discussed, they thought, and they came into recommendation. They are advisory to the table. You are the table. Primacy of the table. You ask the questions. Don't get trapped up in this committee versus committee nonsense. That's not why you create committees. They don't become the board just because they're a committee. Me focus on the members, personal integrity talked about, and ability to stay the course. Next. So let me stop for a second. What questions? It's like an auction sale. If you scratch your head, you get a question in. Yes, here.
Your last point about the committees and the board, is it not also important that the board does not take the role of the committee either? They should be asking questions.
Yeah. Yeah, you got to be, and again, there should be a protocol that's established by policy that says if the board has committees, and typically they would be membership committee or a recruitment committee, there'd be a finance committee, there might be an operations committee. The notion is that those committees are designed to help us make good decisions. And so if you have committees of the board and the issue that you're dealing with falls under one of their mandates, refer the issue to the committee. Expect advice. My point is, don't accept it holus bolus just because the committee recommended it. The fact that the committee recommended it means to me they've thought about it. You ought to give some consequence to that, but it shouldn't stop you from asking the question. Why would we do this versus that? And presumably the committee chairman can answer. What happens when you have a series of committees is that committees start playing games with each other. And they say to each other, well, if you don't ask me any questions, I won't ask you any questions. Like somehow that's good for good governance. That's ridiculous. George.
Thank you. George Sewell, Spruce Grove Ag Society. George, I'll just throw a scenario, and this is a planning scenario. A group of individuals have a planning workshop.
Yeah.
Decide on 10 goals.
Yeah.
They take one goal, requires a terms of reference for that to reach that goal.
Yeah.
Same people, agreement all the way down the line. They have a hole that needs to be dug. That's the goal.
Yeah.
So the terms of reference says how the hole's going to get dug. They need a shovel.
Yeah.
Okay, they agree on the terms of reference. They get to the point about operating the shovel and everybody dies in the woodwork. What do you think went wrong there?
Well, there's two things that happen. One is called membership fatigue, which is when you take board members who are already active, put them at a board table, which is what they thought they signed on for, then move them over to a planning committee, then take the planning committee and put them into a retreat for a whole day Saturday. They come through a whole thrashing out exercise, typically nominal group technique it's called, where they prioritize 10 issues. They're all in agreement to the 10 issues. Then they say, oh, let's take issue number whatever and we'll address that issue. My question would be, how did you pick that, by the way? But that's another question. And then they say, right, well, we require all of this help to get this done. And all of a sudden you see somebody hitting the pause button. And the reason they're hitting the pause button is when they signed on to the board in the first place, they thought they signed on for a once-a-month meeting. And you're now into 3 meetings in the month plus a work exercise. That's often that's one of the things that stops good board functioning. The second thing that can happen is when you've got somebody who thought issue number 1 was the priority, issue number 8 was actually down on number 8 spot, and the fact we're tackling it first, I'm ticked off, and they bail on you. So those were 2 things that would come to mind. If there's a third, tell me what I missed. I thought I just did that, from which I may never recover. Yeah, it's great if you have, it's a question of do we have an advisory board, an advisory committee, or do we have those that are planning to be operational at the same time? And where the board is of the mind that it's there to set direction but not carry it out, that's role clarity. So if you have the Ag Society that has 3 staff, often the Ag Society's presumption is those 3 staff are going to get the job done. We're simply setting direction. If you have 1 staff member, which I think you do, as a full-time employee or at least a contracted employee, that you need to very clearly define what do we do as a board, what is governance, and then what is our volunteer role as board members, and what does the executive director do? And boy, I'll tell you, I'd be real clear about that because your executive director's job, it seems to me, is to probably not do everything they thought the board was going to do. And it's this dysfunction that happens or this clash that happens between role clarity. I mean, if it wasn't those 2 words, I'd have been out of business 35 years ago. No matter how long we preach this, people bump into each other all of the time. Tanya, speak loudly.
Meeting behind closed doors.
Most of us understand that an executive committee will be more in touch with the executive director than the rest of us. Most of us understand, or we should, that therefore an executive committee should be doing the performance review of the executive director. That requires it to be in camera, confidential, behind closed doors. Most of us might understand that if there's some big negotiation to go on with the province or whoever it is, that's probably going to be done behind closed doors, with a caveat. And the caveat is, when does that discussion have to become public? When do we have to share what we've talked about with the rest of the members? And that's why you need to define these boundaries. What are we allowed to have in camera or behind closed doors? What do we need to have in public with the rest of our members? And the moment you don't clarify that is the moment you got this, and the moment you got undermining, and the moment you got lack of confidence, and the moment you've got inside destruction. Implosions happen within organizations largely because the roles are not clear, mandate is not clear, policies are not clear, all of that happens. And bang, you've got all the characteristics and ingredients for a major disaster. Question?
Actually, can we, say, an executive, say, treasurer?
Oh, absolutely, but you need, there's no, yeah, absolutely, but you need to have a mandate statement for the executive that says, here's how the executive can meet, under what topics, under what conditions, and when does it have to report to the full membership. Oh, you can still meet, but you'll just remember my lecture today and you'll realize that we're about to get shot.
Yeah.
Then you go to the full membership at the annual meeting and you say, here's a template of terms of reference. Drop me a note, I'll send you a template. Here's a template of terms of reference for what the executive should be able to do on its own. Now, the question always is of members is, do you trust the executive? Like, why would I not, as a mayor and council, take every issue in Spruce Grove back to the electorate? The answer is they elected me to govern, that's why. Yeah. So if they elect you at a general meeting to be the executive, my presumption is they trust you. If they elect a board of 15 and you say we need an executive of 4, then the board of 15 says these 4 people have the authority to do the following things between board meetings. Just don't step over the traces, because that's what kills executive board confidence.
Yeah, but you're right, you have to kind of get things done.
Yes, you have to make sure the rules are defined. We're going to stop and take a short break. I'll come back to your question in 5 minutes. The reason why I focused on primacy of the table is because it's absolutely fundamental to good governance. Primacy of the table says we understand as a board where or council where we make decisions. Just remember that. We understand as a board or council where it is we are to make decisions. And the moment you divert off of that, just realize that you're on something that looks and smells a bit like quicksand. Because it'll eventually swallow you up and you'll be in big trouble. So I'll give you an example of quicksand. A quicksand is you walking outside the meeting and talking in the parking lot, which is where half board meetings take place. I remember talking to a counselor one time who said, well, I don't understand why our CIO doesn't act on our direction. I said, well, what do you mean by that? Well, we all agree on something, we give direction, the person doesn't act. I ask at the next meeting, nothing's happened. I said, well, you got an example? Yeah, this last meeting, that's what I'm referring to. I said, well, let's get the minutes out. So I get out the minutes and the person says, well, we directed them to do thus and so. And I say, would that be towards the end of the meeting? Oh, yeah, that was it, towards the end of the meeting. Well, let's look at those minutes, the end of the meeting. I said, I don't see that point here. Oh. Well, maybe that was it. We had a discussion after the meeting. But we're all there sitting at the table and the manager is sitting right there listening in. And they didn't act. I said, you know something? You just went fishing. All the stuff after meeting is fishing. You just went for a walk in the park. The minute, which by the way is the motion, the minute is what directs activity. Nothing else. You want to know what causes action from a board? It's what resolution you just passed. That's what causes action. Nothing else. So make sure that you absolutely are clear. The second thing I wanted to mention is that there are various kinds of boards and executive directors or senior staff person. The best mix is a board that knows what it's doing, has strength as a board, has confidence as a board, because it's come to this kind of a session, understands its role, ready to get at it, and a strong CEO or executive director. Somebody who has their own advice, their own opinion, their own expertise, and they're not afraid to say to the board, I think this is the direction we should be going in, and why. And from time to time, it's called constructive discord, where you bump into each other and don't necessarily see eye to eye. And often, out of that constructive conflict comes very good solutions, because you're both bringing ideas to the table. What is often the worst is where you have a strong chair and weak board, and the chair becomes potentate, grand poobah, all the things I described as they am not to be. That's what happens, because the chair starts to put tire tracks up and down the face of all the board members. Should never happen, but does. Or you have a strong executive director and a weak chair. And pretty soon the executive director is running the board, and the board's going to be putting their hands up at the right time. All those in favor? It's like you're practicing the Queen's wave after a while. What you need is some balance, and if you don't have that, folks, you're on very slippery turf, because the strong executive directors will move into a leadership role because nobody's leading. So if you're on a board with a weak chair, then you as an executive committee better start leading. You better start shoring up the chair. And if you're an executive director with a weak board, be very cautious that you're not stepping into their role, because it's called a career-limiting decision. Third thing, regardless, my wife would be surprised to hear me say this, but I don't have all the answers. Don't say that to my wife if you ever meet her. Here's George, he has all the answers. I don't. Actually, there are some, limited, admittedly, but so other people do. They fill in the blanks, and I typically leave a lot of blanks to be filled in. So I'm going to give you a couple of names and phone numbers or emails. Question over here.
What factors do you consider when determining what the most effective size of board would be as far as numbers?
That's a real good question. What's the factor in determining size of the board? It'd be a couple that would come to mind, and I'm not sure I've covered this, but if I don't, one would be the size of your mandate. So do you have a complex mandate or a very narrow mandate? If you have a complex mandate, you're probably going to require 2 or 3 other members on the board. That would, to me, drive size. If you have a fairly simplistic mandate, i.e. we're in one business, we do one thing, that probably means a board of 5. If you have a complex mandate, I would be surprised if any of you had larger than a board of 13 to 15. So it should be based on, to some extent, size of mandate, secondly, size of membership. I mean, if you've got a membership base of 50 and you've got a board of 25, my guess is you've got far too many. The third factor would be, do we have access to paid staff? If we do, a larger board is probably going to end up causing that person to have gray hair or none shortly. So what does a board as a team look like? We talked about that, I think, in other points, Tim. Right. You know, when we talk about do we treat the board chair with respect, the answer is we ought to. Whether you agree with the board chair or not is the issue. The answer is, do we treat the office with respect? This is not an easy job. So do we treat the office of chair with respect? I would presume you do. When you're at a meeting, do you allow the chair to run the meeting or do you fight every decision? That's a manner of showing respect. Do I have to argue with everything? Am I just being argumentative or am I asking good questions? It's a matter of respect. So you have to have chairs that are allowed to do their job, and I would argue that there are ways of showing that. So what's some critical learnings? And I'm going to move through some of this again reasonably quickly. One is this, and again, there are certain basic principles today that I think have to resonate with all of you, one of which is tone at the top. We as board leaders, we as board governors, actually set the tone of what happens in our organization. How people view your REA, Ag Society, fill in the blank, church board, or whatever it is a reflection on your leadership. What is the tone at the top of, you just think, for example, I don't know what communities you live in, but think of your vision of your town or county or city council. So, who sets the tone for that? I can tell you in Edmonton it's set by Mayor Mandel and his councillors. I can tell you that the mayor has a larger impact on image than almost anybody else. I can tell you that most of you couldn't name the city manager. I can tell you that you can name the mayor, you can name the reeve in your county, you can name some of the councillors perhaps. Tone at the top is set by leadership. How do we see this organization? Are they an organization that does things above board, or are they kind of surreptitious, hide behind the issues? What's our impression? Are they honest folks? Are they trying hard to represent us? Are they pretty candid? Are they pretty open? Or do they do most of their meetings in camera? It's ironic to me, by the way, that councils get elected on the basis of open and transparent government. The first decision they ask to make is, when can we go in camera? It's a true story. So the tone at the top, the board as the primary agency, sets the tone from a policy perspective. Underline those two words, policy perspective, and then ask yourself, put a question mark beside it and say, what policies do we operate under? And I'll guarantee you, some of the boards in this room do not have any. You have past practice. You have ways of operating. It's not based in policy, it's based on how you did it last year. And someday, somebody's going to challenge you and say, why do you do it that way? And you're going to say, the answer, because we've always done it that way. It's a terrible answer. The words and actions of staff determine the tone. If you've got staff going in one direction, board in the other, you've got a dysfunctional organization. If you've got staff that are undermining, crapping on board members, it's useless, it's terrible. And you ought to be talking about pulling the plug. You can't have staff that are disrespectful of the board. I don't care if they like the board or not, that's not the issue. The issue is, do I respect, because I'm a mature person. Do we respect the roles of staff that are there? Do we agree to certain protocols? Can, for example, a board member phone a staff member and say, you ought to do thus and so? I mean, is that how the Spruce Grove Ag Society operates? They phone the staff member and say, is it Ella? Is that Ella? This is what you need to do. See, Ella's question should be, and who gives you authority to give me direction? Because I thought I acted for the full board, not for one of you. Otherwise, you've got 7 people giving 7 sets of direction. Boards need to function as a corporate body, not as a group of individuals who think that they have power over a staff member. You want to create a disharmony quickly, that's a quick way to do it. You want to cause problems as a staff member? Start jumping to the pumps every time a board member phones you. What you do is you send a note back to all the board members saying, I just had this request. It seems to me this should be a direction from the board. Would the board please place it on its agenda? Or I'll be placing it on your next agenda. We need a direction. We need a decision. I say to staff members, if you're ever asked for information, your first protocol when you send it out, if you're the executive director, is to send it to every board member. It doesn't matter if just one member asked you. It's the principle of concurrent information. And concurrent information says we're all entitled to get the same information at the same time. Yes, over here.
Just a quick question. If you don't have a policy, but there's been a decision made in a past meeting that's in the minutes, does that have any reflection on it?
Absolutely. That becomes the policy. Whatever your decisions made at a board becomes the policy. My argument is you just thought it was a resolution. You thought it was a one-off.
But it wasn't put in the policy.
I know, but the fact that it was the decision of the board means it has the same clout as the policy does. I would just say if that resolution deals with a big issue or a repetitive issue, let's write it up as a policy. And electronically or hard copy, let's have our own board governance policy manual. My second last point is not me trying to find work because I don't need any. It's proactive governing boards look at how they do business and say, is this the right way? Is there a better way? Because we have 5 committees, should we have 5 committees for the next 5 years? So who challenges that? The answer is you do. The answer is board governance structure, board governance style, board governance committees are all owned by you. They're not written in stone by anybody else, they're yours. Do they function? If they don't, can them. Great quote by Peter Drucker, who I referenced earlier, is one of his best quotes ever, says, there's nothing more useless in life than doing efficiently that which should not be done at all. It's a great quote. Yes? You're only allowed 10 questions per person. Go ahead.
This is my second one.
I know.
How do you rescind a policy that's been...
How do you rescind a policy? You come to a board meeting and I'm not sure how you create the agenda, but at some point on the agenda you typically have other business. Yeah. If you have other business, that's often an invitation for you to put an item on there. Most people ignore that, but that's what it is. And so you say other business, under other business, Madam Chair, just when we get the meeting started, just so we can all have the same agenda, I would like to challenge a current policy that we have, and I would like to see us review that policy. It's the policy on XYZ. Okay. When you get to the item on the agenda, you say, I have real concerns about policy XYZ, which is what we've been following. I think we need to reflect on it. I think we need to challenge it. And I think what we're doing today no longer even reflects that policy. I think we need to revisit it. If you like, I'll take first crack at it. It's called creating the straw man. I'll create the straw man, which means we all get a chance to take a whack at it at the next meeting. Never try to get something changed or approved at one meeting. And I probably should have said this earlier. There's a great principle. This is a Cuffism, but it's a great principle that says first heard, deferred. You got that? First heard, deferred. What that says is that the first time we hear an issue presented is not when we decide. Why? Because we haven't had a chance to reflect on it. We haven't had a chance to think it through. We haven't had a chance to consider the consequences or the options. We just heard the issue. So when Cuff was first elected, along with 6 other council members, 5 of whom were brand new, by the way, on my council in Spruce Grove, we had a delegation the opening night. Delegation came in, and I could tell people if it wasn't for the table in front of us, we'd have leapt across and embraced them all. That was marvelous. Oh, they just had such a great presentation. I told them they were wonderful. I said it was marvelous. Oh, it was a great idea. Can't believe we hadn't thought of it before. Somebody want to make a motion? So moved, said somebody. We dispensed with seconders. Discussion? None. That's a great idea. All those in favor? 7 hands. So what's wrong with that? Well, the next morning I got a phone call, and somebody started off by saying, yeah, but. And you know what they did? It was terrible. But what they did is they pointed out that that coin that I saw the night before actually had a reverse side to it. It's amazing, eh? The delegation came in and gave me a coin with 5 points on it that all made great sense. And what they didn't say is that same coin had another side to it with another 5 points on it, which said those first 5 points made no sense. Contradicted every one of them. And this person that phoned me the next morning says, Mr. Mayor, what you didn't ask is, and they gave me a list of questions I should have thought of asking the night before, but I didn't. I was so impressed by the delegations the first time I saw 5 people in front of me. They were looking for my wisdom as mayor. It was marvelous. They called me Mr. Mayor. I could hardly get my head in the door. It was amazing. I can tell you that we blew it. I can tell you that we decided the next meeting, it's the last time we'll make a decision the first time we hear the issue. You know what that principle is based on? It's based on 2 things. One, we had hundreds of thousands of dollars of paid staff sitting beside us that we never asked them, is this a good decision? So we're being absolutely disrespectful, discourteous, and stupid. And secondly, we had no time to reflect. There's a great verse in the Bible that I've yet to hear a sermon on that says, and Mary took all these things and pondered them in her heart. You know what we don't do? We don't ponder. We go from A to B. Remember what I started off talking about, decision-making process? We go from here to here. What should a board do? A board should stop and ponder. A board should reflect. That's what boards are designed to do. They elect you to reflect, to think it through. You don't do that when you hear something for the first time. Don't jump to the pumps because somebody says, oh, you ought to be decisive. That's not being decisive, it's being foolish over here.
The challenge with that, though, is not studying it 11 times. There has to be a balance. We have to make them, like, I'm on a school board and we'll end up doing it 9 times before we actually make a decision, where the first time it wasn't that big an issue, we should have done it. And maybe we can do it to a point where that we can undo something if it is wrong.
Yeah.
But at least let's start down the path of making a decision, rather than bureaucracy of studying it, of studying it, of studying it.
Yeah, and what you present is the opposite end of the other spectrum, which says we're an organization that defers to the point of inertia, and we do nothing. We're paralysis analysis by or paralysis by analysis. So I would agree with you, but don't overreact and say, no, we're going to make a quick decision. I can tell you you'll regret those words.
Especially on a major issue.
Yeah, major issue, you say, no, A, we get the issue, B, we have the research, C, we have our discussion, and D, we decide. The moment you start going back and forth on asking more and more and more questions and deferring, I can tell you the advice is not going to change. Question to the back.
I heard you use the word resolution and motion. Is there a difference, and if so, what is it?
Both can be used in most board meetings interchangeably. You'd be hard-pressed to define the two separately. So the resolution is, we, the board members, resolve to do. A motion is, be it resolved, I therefore move. There's no difference. So motion is a resolution to the council or the board. By the way, I'll give you a quick insight. Board meetings drag on sometimes interminably. Often they drag on because nobody knows what it is you're talking about. I hate to tell you that, but everybody thinks they do, but nobody does. So what you need to have, a good decision-making process starts with a motion. So if the item is described in advance, that's the advantage of an agenda package. If the item is sent out to you and in advance it says, here's the item, I don't care how professional this looks, If you're interested, I'll send what's called a request for decision to Lisa, and she can send it out to you. It's a one-pager. It says cover these topics, and you'll have everything you need in one page. Every board should have this as a document. I can tell you once you've used it once at a board meeting, you'll never be without it. Why? Because it focuses your decision-making around the key issues. It's an RFD, it's called. Put the RFD in front of people, you have all of the issues you need to have, and then the motion is at the bottom of the page. What's the recommendation to follow? And somebody can say, so moved. So you've got everything you need to know. You've got a motion on the floor saying, so moved, this recommendation. When the recommendation's moved, the chair can now coordinate the meeting and call people out of order, because the only thing that establishes order is the motion. There is no order before a motion's on the floor. And no chair can say to somebody, you're out of order. They'll say, well, this is what I thought the topic was all about. Well, this is what I thought the topic. It's useless. The motion defines order. You want to try that out? Go to an annual general meeting where you don't have a motion on the floor. You'll have all kinds of discussion, and nobody will know what the heck the topic is at the end of it. So role clarity, need to clearly define board roles. I've talked about that, talked about the fact that the board roles should be defined in writing. What is the role of our board? What are we empowered to do as a board? That should be a role statement brought back to the board, approved by the board, taken to the membership. Do you as a membership agree these are the roles of our board? We operate between annual general meetings. We do not have the authority to change the bylaws or constitution. We don't have the authority to change the budget once it's approved unless we can adjust by, say, 3% or whatever your policy is. This is what we do. We operate within those parameters. That's what a board should be entitled to do. So you're functioning on behalf of the membership. Next. So how does it apply to you? You have a protocol or a policy around role clarity, policy or protocol around board contact with staff, what I was talking about earlier. You have a protocol around one employee, i.e. we deal through the executive director of the chamber. We don't deal through everybody else. We have a protocol around personal attacks on staff. If that ever happens at a board meeting, you've got a very dysfunctional organization. You do not attack staff at a board meeting or an annual general meeting, nor do you permit staff to be attacked at an annual general meeting or a board meeting. You want to have any discussion around staff performance, you have a motion to go in camera, which is another word for saying in private at the end of the meeting, and the only people there are the board members and the staff member. You can do what I call a double in camera, and the staff member can also be asked to leave. Priorities, not busyness. I mean, I deal with all kinds. I tell you, I was sitting in the anteroom of a deputy minister's office waiting to have my meeting with the deputy minister. This is a provincial government here. And as I'm sitting there, of course, I'm the usual fidgety kind of person looking for things to read or do. And because I'm not smart enough like Mr. Bidlock to have a BlackBerry or an iPad, and my phone calls have all dried up, I'm sitting there looking at these newsletters and stuff. And I start to read the odd one, and one of those from Saskatchewan Association of Rural Municipalities. You can see how scintillating and exciting that would be. So I'm reading about the problems of canola, which apply to the city of Spruce Grove, not. And in the middle of this magazine is kind of a Playboy fold-out, and it's got the 2 months of May, June, every date in there, and what your board members have been doing on every date of those 2 months. So almost by acronym that they attended this meeting and that meeting, and what board members went, and so on. And the message is, we, the board, have been busy on your behalf, right? 2 pages, just chock full of these meetings. The only thing missing are 2 words in the bottom right-hand corner, and the 2 words should be, so what? Remember my little clip about John Cleese? Why meet? So what? Like, what did we accomplish, folks? As a board, you should have this annual report to your membership. And the annual report should say, so what? We served as your board for a year. What did we accomplish? That's a great challenge. When we met, I met for 2,000 times in 12 years. I attended 2,000 meetings as a mayor, either in my own community or through AUMA or FCM or other boards that I chaired and served on. The question would be, other than I know you're all impressed by that, would be, so what? What did we accomplish? And quite frankly, I probably couldn't tell you all the exact things because that's all blended into memory now, but there were some key things we accomplished. So it's the so what that's important. So priority setting says, what are our priorities in what areas? As a governance body, what's our priority with regard to the main clients we serve? What's our priority with regard to our own leadership, with regard to our own administration, with regard to our own governance policies? All those are priorities. Next. Next. So that simply says part of the job around priority setting is to report back to our members. Communication says we need to make sure that not only do we get other people telling us stuff to do, we need to make sure we're communicating with our members. And one of the things that was pointed out to me loud and clear in Manning recently and in Winfield is that the average member did not know what it is you were doing as a board. We need to learn from issues of others. That's my reason for giving examples, is because all of you learn when I'm telling you examples. You say, I can relate to that. That's what we did. Communication says we get information out. We make sure our members know exactly what it is we're doing and why it's important. Don't send out the minutes necessarily. Send out a précis and say, here's the 3 or 4 key things we worked on and decided on at the last meeting. Make this stuff come alive. Nothing more boring than the annual report with the financial statement in it, and people's eyes gloss over and you say, there, we reported. No, you don't. Highlight it in 2 or 3 paragraphs and say what actually happened. And did this financial statement say we started where we should have started and we ended where we should have ended? Is that what it said? Good, well tell them that. Say we ended up with a bit of a reserve or we had to deplete the reserve. Tell them why. People are going to read it otherwise, so put it in the vernacular. Next. So you need a board-approved policy and goal. What's our policy with regard to communication? We communicate monthly. Is that a policy or not? We just do it whenever we feel like it? What's the policy of your board around communication? What's the policy of your board with regard to a budget around communication? Do we have funds set aside to use to get the message out? The importance of ethics. I mean, I just spent a whole afternoon with the AMD&C, the Alberta Association of Municipal Districts and Counties, all your county councillors, around this one issue of ethics, ethical behavior. I gave them all kinds of chapter and verse of things that should never have happened in municipalities have happened in the last 5 years. Some of which resulted in the government bringing me in as an inspector to say, throw the bums out. And I've done that. And they've got rid of whole councils, and they've got rid of mayors, and they got rid of individual councillors. And some of you were living in the Lakeland Health Authority region when I recommended dismissing the whole board. The government took my report and the next day were in front of the board, pulling the plug. Why do you do that? You do that when unethical behavior is involved. That's why you do it. I got all kinds of time for people that are what I think a bit incompetent. I've yet to recommend firing anybody, by the way, for incompetence. It's amazing, but it's true. I recommended firing a ton of people for a lack of confidence with the people they report to. I've recommended firing a number of people with regard to ethical behavior. Senior level bureaucrats, 37 years in one organization. The chair, the CEO, 25 years being CEO of a major business. And a week later, you saw in the newspaper an advertisement for a vacant chair position, a vacant CEO position. Why? Because the two of them are doing this, playing games the whole time and destroying the organization. You can't afford that. Grow up. I find it amazing organizations pay me to go in and tell them to grow up. The 2 worst councils I've ever dealt with, by the way, are both university communities. Intelligence sometimes has nothing to do with civility. You can have grade 8 people that are far better at dealing with each other individually than somebody that's a university professor. Ethics says we establish the ethical standard and we stick to it. We do not have on the board a decision-making process that allows me as a board member to hire my spouse to manage the facility that we operate as an ag society, for example. Has that happened? Absolutely. Well, they used to volunteer, now we're paying them. And you're making that decision, you're in conflict. It's your spouse. Oh, but they used to volunteer, we got all those free hours. It doesn't matter your rationale, you're in conflict. So you should have a code of conduct for your organization. What's our code of conduct? What do we agree to abide by? It's interesting. But what do we agree to abide by as a board member? Can I take the inside story and tell the community all about it? If you have no code of conduct, I guess you can. You have nothing to put as a constraint around your behavior. You can do whatever you want. You should have constraints. We all should. It's called the 1-over principle, by the way, if you want to make a note of that. What's the 1-over? Staff members 1-over is to the executive director. The executive director's 1-over is to the board. The board's 1-over is to the membership. And if the membership needed a 1-over, they could look up. Next. Importance of self. It's an interesting thing, but you know, after 12 years of being mayor, I went to a local drugstore to pick up pictures my wife had dropped off to be developed. This was like within a day or 2 days of me stepping down as mayor. 12 years, front page, newspaper all of the time. It's almost like the president of Indonesia. Not quite, but anyway. I go to the drugstore and the person looks up and says, "Oh, I know you." As my head again continues to grow, and he proceeds to write down the name of the mayor of the neighboring community of Stony Plain. It's the principle of putting your hand in the bucket of water and pulling it out, folks. I don't care how long you've been there, you can be replaced. It's called being hit by the bus. Succession planning is being hit by the bus. The moment you're hit by the bus, the succession kicks in a hurry. And they say, "Wasn't it too bad?" And next? I hate saying it's that brief, but in some cases it is, folks. It's the hyphen between the two dates on the gravestone. How do we fill in the hyphen? It's an interesting question. The importance of organization is should never exceed your view of your family, should never exceed your view of your principles. Next. Next. I'm not sure. Organizations here with a senior staff member, how many folks have you? We have an executive director, a staff member. Put your hands up. How many folks? So probably a third of the room, perhaps. Okay. Relationship, critical. Trust, absolutely should underline everything you do in your organization. You don't trust the person working for you, make a decision and get on with life. Oh, George, that sounds harsh. Yeah, you're right, it is. It's also true. Key role, the advisor to the board. You want to have two statements. Just boil this down to two things. A, advises the board or the council. B, carries out the direction. Rule number 1 in organizational life is the board is right. Rule number 2 is check rule number 1. Unless the board is doing something illegal, their direction is what staff follow. That's absolutely sound, good governance. They champion the administration. One of my comments in the report in Strathcona, regardless of my other findings, is that the chief commissioner was right to defend his staff member. You can't have a councillor berating a staff member publicly, dumping all over her, and getting away with it. So the staff member's job is to, it's like the hourglass. It's the narrow portion of the hourglass. It's advising up, coordinating down. It doesn't stop everything. It makes sure there's a proper flow to it. Next. 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 Principle of one employee. Organizations that are effective work on the basic principle that if we have 7 employees, 5 employees, 3 employees, we have 1. It's called the executive director, chief executive officer, call the person what you have, administrator, 1 employee. Nothing else works, I can guarantee you. You'll corrupt the organization in a hurry. You'll have every staff member thinking they report to you as the board. They don't. They report to the executive director. Questions are directed through the administrator to other staff, from other staff to the administrator. Well, what if the other staff know more than the administrator? It doesn't matter. It's called protocol. It's called reporting. It's called accountability. That's what that's all about. You want to destroy accountability? Have other staff be able to go around the executive to you as the board. And pretty soon you start to wonder, why do we have an executive director? And the answer is, you're soon to be firing them. That's what you're going to soon do. Why? Because you've kind of figured out that all the other staff must have all the answers. We don't need an executive director at that salary. That's what will happen. Does it happen? It does, actually. Do organizations think they can get away with this? They don't need just one employee? The answer is they try, and then they fail, and they go back and try it again. It's expensive. Does it happen in major organizations? It does, actually. It's amazing, but it does. Does it happen in provincial ministries? Typically not. Why? Because they figured out that the deputy minister is the one who advises the minister. Is that the only person? No, they bring along their assistant deputy ministers, and they're asked questions as well. Have they been briefed before they get to that meeting? The answer is they have. Have they briefed a deputy before they get to the meeting with the minister? They have. Has the city manager been briefed by the department heads before he or she gets to council? They have, or they should have been. Why? Because the city managers in the city of Edmonton is the person that's accountable to council. Department heads screw up, it's the city manager that's accountable. It's a principle of one employee. Next. I talked about concurrent information. That's this whole issue of getting information at the same time as everybody else so that nobody has a sense of getting jerked around with regard to that. Next. Personal relationship, it says if we have staff, we don't become best friends. That's what that says. Don't. Let them have their own best friends somewhere else in the community, but not with you. You ought to be friendly, but not friend of. That's the principle. Why? Because you can't do a performance review on somebody that you're best friends with. If you're having dinners together with spouses involved and so on every Friday night, and sitting together at the movies together every Sunday, and going golfing every Thursday, and da-da-da-da-da, and pretty soon you're really good friends, I can tell you you're absolutely conflicted and biased when it comes time to do the performance review. So do I mean you shouldn't have any contact? The answer is you should have contact with your executive director, your staff. Just try to stay away from becoming the friend of, folks, because you're the one that has to decide do they stay or go. I don't know how you do that when you're the best friends of. Complaints, if you've got a complaint about a board member, you're the one that takes it to the board chair takes it to the board. That's that point. Principle of no surprise says, for example, when I was mayor and I was consulting in Ontario, because I actually had this full-time job called consultant, I would phone back to Spruce Grove and say to our city manager, Gary, what's happening? And Gary would know enough to say, here's 2 or 3 things that are going on that you should be aware of as the mayor. I'd never ask him, how are you doing managing? That was my bailiwick. I'd say, what's happening? He would give me a heads up if something is happening in the community that I should be aware of. The principle is I didn't want to get off the plane in Edmonton 3 hours and 45 minutes later and have somebody meeting their family at the airport and say, gee, that story about da-da-da-da-da. And I'd say, what's that all about? And I didn't want to be embarrassed by not knowing what other people in my own community knew about it unless it only happened in the last 3 hours and 45 minutes. It's the principle of no surprise. The board members should be the first people notified by staff of what's going on in the organization, not somebody else. And it shouldn't be just the board chair, it should be board members. Unless you have a protocol that says the executive director advises the chair and the chair advises everybody else. If that's your protocol, that's fine, that's a protocol. Next. Current skill development says, in our budget we set aside money for our executive director to take courses that allow them to become a better executive director. We as a board attend courses like this to become better at being board members. Those things could be paid for, perhaps not, depending on the size of your organization. Next. Regular briefing says that if we have a staff member, they brief the board on what's happening. They don't keep stuff back. They do it on a regular basis, so every month or every 2 weeks you get a regular briefing. Monitoring the agenda says that we as a board establish the agenda right at the start of our term because we say what are the top 3 or 4 things we want to accomplish. That's called our agenda. That's the broad-based agenda. The individual agenda is what you get every 2 weeks or once a month at a board meeting. That says that we get the board meeting updated. Next. What this says, by the way, just so you don't think I've sloughed through this, is these 3 sides essentially say decision-making, as I talked about at the outset, should have a start point and an end point. Decision-making should reflect certain key principles along the way, should reflect certain key steps, so that when I get to the end of the stage where I need to make a decision, I don't have any question about what's the choices, what are the options, what's the impact on our budget, what's the impact on the existing policy. That's what a good board should have at their fingertips. Do I understand the issue sufficiently that I can make a decision and make it in confidence? That's what you want to be able to do as a board. I don't want to go back and second guess stuff every month. I want to know that I've had at the table what I needed to have at the table. And the moment you sense there's stuff that's not there, say, I think we ought to table this item to the next meeting. It's not urgent, it's not time sensitive, we're jumping ahead with the decision, and we don't have the advice to stand on. Questions?
What's happening in an association where you don't have an executive director, you don't have an discussion executive board, if there's a code of conduct issue or conflict of interest issue that a board member sees and
Affects another board member?
an executive member,
Yeah.
the executive member and the chair are
Yeah, understand.
things like that. So how do you bring it up without
Yeah.
a resolution?
There's a general principle that says that there's no easy way to do a difficult thing. And it's true. Quite frankly, there's no easy way to postpone a difficult thing either. So if, for example, I'm in a board where the board chair and the board vice chair are close buddies, close friends, and I have an issue that affects one or both of them in a conflict, and I'm a member of the outside part of the organization or even the executive, I bring the issue to the table and say, I perceive that this is an issue that affects one or two of our leaders. I believe that those one or two leaders need to step aside on this issue, or you're going to destroy the faith that we have as an organization. I think this will undermine every decision we make afterwards if we have people staying in the decision-making process who are conflicted. Therefore, I think we need to have a discussion around this before we ever get into, should we vote on this with all members present? If the person says to you, no, I'm not conflicted, everybody knows I'm involved in that business, all the usual bump that they throw at you, then you say, well, make sure the records show that we brought this issue forward, we identified the conflict, and all members decided to stay in the room and vote. I would not want to be a member of a board that allowed that to skate through without me having identified that there was a conflict. I want to make sure the minutes reflect the fact that we brought up the fact there was a conflict. And if everybody decides to stay in the room, i.e. to heck with the conflict, that's on their moral choice, not mine. Now, you can make a motion to excuse certain members from the meeting. The motion could fail, because after all, they're voting in favor of staying. There's not much else you're going to do in most organizations because you don't have a lawyer sitting in your right hand to explain to board members how they're in conflict and what it's going to cost them. I, as a mayor, would be able to say to a council member, you're in conflict. You need to declare it, step out of the room. And if they challenge me, I'd say, let's hold off on the issue. We're going to have the lawyer bring in advice, and the lawyer's going to tell you exactly what I just told you. And by and large, they'll step out of the room. It's not worth your family reputation to pretend you're tough enough to withstand any criticism over there.
What would your definition be of unethical?
Does the board have the authority to make that decision? Because it's core to the basis of the organization. My guess is they don't. If they act on their own, they're acting unethically. If the board decides that, gee, we're working hard, we all ought to get an honorarium per month. You know, we ought to, gee, we're volunteering our time and effort for those lazy louts staying at home. Let's all give ourselves $200 a month to be on the board as executive. That's unethical. Why? Because it's a principal change in the way you do business and you didn't take it to the membership as a whole. Unethical behavior sometimes is illegal, sometimes isn't. But I can tell you it still smells. Unethical behavior is you making a decision to hire somebody as your executive director that everybody knows is the spouse of, the bed partner of, whatever, of the person that's the chair of the board or whatever. Is that unethical? It is, actually. I mean, I could give you a list of 50. And just when I think I've run out of the list, somebody will create a few more for me. I just wrote an article called Romance in the Office. It's interesting. First time I've done that one. Romance in the Office. It's actually available on municipalworld.com. It's an interesting one. But I got called about 6 times in 1 month by city managers and CAOs across this province who said, we have a problem, George. We've got our mayor is in bed with our director of finance. Everybody knows about it. It's in the community. Or the city manager would call, or the town manager would call and say, I'm in conflict because I'm in bed with my director of whatever, and that person's on the next list to be rotated when I go on holidays, if in fact they're not on the same beach together. So what do we do? I mean, it's amazing. It's amazing the number of circumstances. My report on the city of Cold Lake mentions that one senior member of council was in a relationship with one of the senior staff members. Well, what it does is it conflicts the organization, because people say, well, you can't tell Sally anything because it's going across the pillow to the mayor or whatever, right? Now, do these things happen? Yeah, they do. Affairs of the heart are hard to rule against. I mean, you're involved in one, then you have a choice to make. Am I okay staying where I'm at, or do I need to bail out? Either the relationship or the organization. And I'm not prudish, I understand it happens. I understand that's human nature. Should it happen? No. Does it happen? Yes. Do we have policies around it? We should have. Somebody's in real trouble. Question at the back. Next. You know, if you're a fairly sizable organization, I would not be surprised if you had an in-camera session at the end of every board meeting. But the in-camera should be very narrowly defined as to what you can do. And what do you go in-camera on? And often it's referred to as the 3 L's. One is land issues, where you're looking to buy or sell land. The moment you mention buying or selling land, you have an impact on the price. So the last thing you want to do is to tell everybody you're going to have an impact on the price. So that's one issue. Second issue is legal. The second L, which means if you're having advice from your solicitor, your lawyer, to anything dealing with your board business, your lawyer is about to change how he or she writes if you tell him it's going to be public. So you deal with that in camera. And the third L is called, for lack of a better word, labor. So if you're dealing anything with personnel choices and decisions, typically, by the way, based on what I just lectured you on, that's only to do with one employee called your CEO, executive director, whatever you call that person. That also should be done in camera. To me, that's cuffism, but a double in camera is you go in camera at the end of the meeting, you have your board members and your CEO, your executive director. That's an in-camera meeting, public's excluded. That calls in camera. At the end of the meeting, you may decide that you actually want to talk about your executive director, or you want to talk about each other, which I think is healthy, by the way. I think you ought to do a round table at the end of the meeting and say, how did we act as a board toward each other? How am I doing as chair? All of that's more constructive if you don't have an audience. So you can actually be in camera for that kind of discussion. As long as you're not moving the yardsticks, you can be in camera. So in other words, you're not moving a decision. So a double in camera would be you say to the executive director, have a nice evening. We'll sit and talk for a while because we're going to talk about how we're doing. And they're going to think to themselves, yeah, but you're also going to talk about me. And the answer is we probably will. And so what the chair is then designated to do is to take up any issues with the executive director the next morning or the same evening and say, we talked, and yeah, we talked about how you're doing. We think overall you're doing great. A couple of things people express concern about, and here they are. The advantage of that is you get a heads up well before it becomes a disaster. Was there one other question? I thought I saw a hand. Yes.
I was wondering with respect to chairing a meeting. I believe that it was mentioned that it doesn't necessarily have to be conducted in accordance with parliamentary procedure.
Oh yeah, no, that's not the point. It does. I'm just saying the parliamentary procedure is defined by you. Your organization says what rules will we accept as parliamentary rules for our organization. In the absence of defining your own, you'll end up using Robert's rules or some rules of order. You have to have rules of order. My observation is you ought to have your own. You ought to pass your own as a resolution of your board. The following rules will apply to how we run meetings. If you don't, then the Robert's rules or some other rules will apply because somebody will say, geez, you're not doing business according to Robert's rules. I can tell you I've attended those 2,000 meetings. You know how many times Robert's rules came up? 0. Why? Because people abided by their own rules of procedure. They didn't need to refer to some outside instrument that was designed for other kinds of organizations. It's the old joke about 5 guys getting together and forming a fishing society because they all love fishing. And somebody on Wednesday says, the weather's going to be great on Saturday, let's all go fishing. And the other guy says, we can't, we have to serve a notice of motion, that takes 2 weeks. So you've got to ask yourself, do our rules of procedure, do our rules of engagement apply to us? And if you're writing something as broad as Robert's rules, in my mind, they'll apply to a whole lot of organizations. They may not apply to yours.
George, in camera, is it always usually at the end of the meeting? We used to have ours at the beginning.
You can either do the beginning or the end. I would never do it in the middle because then you just destroy harmony within the organization. And if you happen to have any media around, they'll quickly figure out what you're talking about and you'll get roasted. So, or if you have any public, and they'll say, oh, you guys just act behind closed doors. So if you're going to have in camera, I would have it preferably at the end because some of those issues may well be resolved during the meeting or may come up during the meeting.
But you can still have us make a resolution after you come out of camera.
Yeah, the only thing you can do in camera, under normal circumstances, you can vote to go in camera and you vote to come out of in camera. You don't have the authority to make decisions in camera. Unless, of course, your rules of engagement are different than what I just cited. I don't want to be confusing, but that's the best thing to do is have a motion go in, motion come out. And then if you want to make a motion and still not tell anybody what you're doing, just say, we move that the personnel report be accepted. What did that say? Nothing. What happened? Somebody's down the road tomorrow. Yes.
I have a question for you about a parents' council society. So the principal has to sit on the meetings.
Yeah.
There is parents that want to come, they don't feel free to talk about some issues they're having.
Yeah.
They want to, so what would you suggest we do? Because we would like to have sometimes the teachers not sit in the meeting and just everybody talk freely and openly.
Yeah, well then I would say, I would designate the chair to go and talk to the principal and say the only way we're going to have an open and free discussion about some of the issues that are really significant is if you're not here. What we will do, if you agree, is we'll send the chair in to talk to you the following day about what those issues were. But we want to have a free-for-all discussion. Otherwise, these things are going to simply boil over, and that gets real messy when the boiling over happens. Right. Now, if you're an absolute control freak as a principal, you won't like what Cuff just said.
Right, and it already happened, and it was like, yeah, the superintendent, no, well, yeah, so.
And pretty soon things boil over, they hit the superintendent. Sure, you can make a motion to say we direct the chair to request the principal and any other paid staff of the organization to be absent at the end of the meeting when the board wishes to go in camera to discuss issues that may in fact impact their work or their responsibilities. The chair will also be designated to take up those same issues with the principal so that there's an ongoing loop in the communication. So make sure, and we've talked about this in terms of understanding board role, board mandate, board principles, board guidelines, board constitution. Make sure that's all there in front of you. The other effective principle is effective organization or orientation. Are we oriented to our roles? Do we understand what that looks like? I would recommend every one of you have even a small orientation manual that says, who are we? What's our objects? What does the Constitution or bylaws say? You'd be amazed how many people serve on boards that have never seen your bylaws or Constitution. What's the structure of the board? What's the last set of minutes say? What does the set of minutes say for the annual general meeting? What does it say in terms of finance and budget? All of those instruments should be inside of your orientation package, and somebody should be walking a new member through the orientation. That should be your chair, typically, to say to the new member, here's what we're about, here's what we do, here's how we do business. Here's our rules of conduct. Any questions? I mean, in some organizations, that's 1 or 2 days to do that. Some cases, in the case of the City of Edmonton, when they do the orientation for City Council, they do it over 3 weeks. This is big business, folks. Peter, how long was it with the county? 3 or 4 days? 5 days of orientation to be on county council. So orientation is important. You want to get off on a good start. Make sure people know what it is you do. Don't presume they know because they joined. Make sure you tell them what it is you're doing. Board independence, by the way, I'll stop for a moment on that one. Board independence says we as a board have the authority to meet just as a board from time to time. The 2 times you ought to meet, any one of you as a board by yourselves, 2 times at minimum. One is when you're reviewing your staff members, if you have any. That's 1 time to meet, on your own, independently. The second time is to meet with the auditor. Does that mean we don't trust the staff to meet with the auditor? Actually, we expect the staff to have already met with the auditor. We're meeting with the auditor to ask audit questions on behalf of our board members. Audit questions to be asked of an auditor. Should they be asked? Absolutely. Do I have to be a financial genius to figure out the answers? No. You want a good question for an auditor? You say to the auditor, you've just audited our books this past year. Tell us, are we in good financial shape or not? Is there anything we should be really aware of as a board? If they'd had asked that in a few places I've dealt with, they would have not had the problems they had, because nobody asked the question. We talked about primacy of the table. I'm going to go by that. These are summary points. I'm not trying to not talk about it. You feel free to raise a question. I'm happy to do it. And again, it's simply this principle, an absolutely foundational principle, is our table a primary place of decision making, or do we allow people to make decisions where we're not included? Next. Relationship, we've talked about that. How about evaluation? Evaluation is critical. If you have a staff member, at minimum once a year, you do a formal evaluation. How do we do that? Take a look at the format that you used the last time. If it's not very good, drop me a note and I'll send you one. You need to have an evaluation that's ground into what does this person actually do? And are we satisfied with what it is they do? Next. Next. Talked about policy oversight. That's interesting, by the way. The minute you agree to step onto a board is the minute you own the board's policies. The moment you're on a board, you own its policies and its bylaws. The question is, have you ever asked to see what they are? If you don't have them, I can tell you, you better start reading past minutes, because that's what the organization's run by as your resolutions. In the absence of policies, in the absence of bylaws, your organization's run by your resolutions, by your motions. Are you in agreement with them? You think they're fine? You want to know why you do certain things? It's in the motions that your board has approved previously. That's what the policy bank talks about. Next. Next. I'll say this to you several times, and there are probably several times I'll use this statement, but you know, if you had a takeaway from this session, one of the principal takeaways besides role clarity and governance policies would be clarity of vision. What are we as an organization trying to accomplish? Where are we going from here? Are we simply repeating last year, or are we doing something different? What's the vision of this organization? And I can tell you, it better be owned by the board. I don't care who drafted it, it better be owned by the board. Now that to me means the board's had a principal role in discussing it. I don't care if some of the ideas came from your executive director or staff, the board had better own its vision. Where to from here as a board? I dealt with one board, by the way, it was a seniors foundation, where the CEO didn't want the board to meet and talk about vision because the vision had been written into plaques and the plaques were already up on the wall. Yes. No, again, you have to ask the question, what are the procedures that guide our meeting? And one of the procedures should talk about how do we as a board get to go behind closed doors when it's appropriate. If we're talking about the hiring and firing of a person, that's absolutely essential that you do that in camera. You're talking about the evaluation. It's essential you do this in camera. So how do we do this in camera stuff? The answer is, and it should be in your board protocol or your procedures, the answer is we have a motion to move in camera. Now sometimes you'll say a motion to go in camera to discuss personnel matters. Motion to go in camera to discuss land issues, right? Motion to go in camera to review the legal advice we received. You don't describe in so much detail that everybody knows what it is you're going to do when you're in there. And then your second motion, this is not in every organization, but now in more and more, your only other motion is to come out of in camera. So you can discuss for however long you have to, and the motion is to come out of in camera, and then there should be a motion to accept the report, which you discussed in camera, the decision, the direction, right? So that whatever you're deciding to do is a public decision. The board members can know that the board members decided to accept the advice of the chair with regard to personnel matters. Now somebody at your annual meeting is going to say, what the heck was that? And you can say, well, as you're probably all aware by now, we've made a decision to part company with our last CEO and to hire someone new. You don't go into any detail, you don't start trashing anybody, or you're going to be looking at something called a lawsuit. So it's the motion to go in, motion to go out. You can't just go in camera and say, well, I think we'll all go in camera now. Geez, who gives you authority to do that? So it should be it should be covered by board procedures. Next. This board member proactive involvement simply says, we try to find out ways to hear what our members are saying to us. That's what that says. You need to have good clarity of relationship with your own membership. Next. Board advocacy, what do we do as a board? Well, we advocate on behalf of our members. We advocate to an outside world, we advocate to county council, we advocate to the provincial government, we have some role of trying to get more funding, we have somebody that advocates on our behalf, and the advocate is the chairman, vice chairman of the board. We send minimum of 2 members to advocate. Why? Because we have this principle of accountability, and we have this principle of transparency, and we don't want 1 member conveying our message, we want 2 members. That's what that says. Effective advocacy. Somebody is our advocate, which is why I say to people who serve on county and town and village councils, never serve on other boards as their chairman. Why? Because you become their advocate. That's why. You can't chair anything without advocating on their behalf. And if you're a councillor, what you're advocating on behalf of is the value of the council, not the value of the library board. Let the library board chairman do that on your behalf. Next.
Question on the ethics, that one.
Yeah.
So if you have a staff member, can they be designated as the advocate rather than...
If you have a staff member, it's a really good question. The staff member is never the advocate. The staff member is never with you at any meeting where you're voting, unless they're there as your advisor only. It's a principle of democracy. Those that are elected vote, those who are appointed advise. Pretty simple. So should the executive director be with you as you're going in to meet a cabinet minister or going in to meet whoever it is, county council or whatever it is? The answer is sure they should. They should advise you all the way to the front door. And the moment the front door opens, they should shut up. And you should be the one talking to the decision maker. It's a basic principle of politician to politician. If you're on a board, I hate to tell you this, but you're the politician arm of the board, the legislative arm of the board. You're it. If you're a staff member, it's bureaucrat to bureaucrat. You talk to the bureaucracy of the organization. The discussion in terms of policy should happen at the policy level. George.
If the minister brings their deputy minister along,
Yeah, if the minister was to bring along a deputy minister, it's fair ball for you to have your executive director in the same meeting. I would just be real careful that the executive director on your behalf doesn't start taking your agenda. Because I've dealt with too many cabinet ministers that say, gee, is that board running the show or is there staff telling the board what to do? So regardless if you're a staff member and sitting there just itching to say something, stifle it. Anyway, challenges and landmines, key 1. First one out of the gate. How do we add value as a board? I can tell you something, if you've got a blank expression when that question's asked, you've got to be asking yourself, are we a board or are we just bored? Are we leading or are we following? Are we in charge or are we pondering? What was that old book, When in Doubt, Mumble? When in charge, when in trouble, when in charge, ponder, when in trouble, delegate. It's great expressions. So are you pondering? Yeah, you should ponder, and then you should decide, as we talked about over here. Develop a course and stick with it. Dialogue with your members. Focus on issues. Lack of confidence in the advice of any staff members is a killer. Focusing on what management does rather than on what we do. They don't probably need your help if you have staff. They probably need your guidance. They don't need you helping running the office. Next. No sense of resource requirements. So we say to our staff, we've got to do this, this, and this, and this. Or if you're a volunteer board with no staff, you're saying we need to do this, this, and this, and this. And you realize, geez, I just got a whole list of things to do. I have no resources to do it with. I did work on Vancouver Island for the District of Highlands. Some of you would know that as you leave Victoria, one of the signs says District of Highlands, turn right. It's on the road towards Nanaimo, very close to Victoria, nice little picturesque community in the woods. It's the only organization I've ever reviewed that had the same number of council members, 7, as the same number of staff, 7. Was it over-governed? The answer is it was. But in any case, I said to the CAO, the Chief Administrative Officer, what priorities do you have? George, he says, you want to see priorities? He gave me 21-page booklet of priorities. 21 pages. I said, this is unbelievable. He said, you're right. I said, this is intimidating. He said, you're right. I said, this is impossible to achieve. He said, you're right. I said, so what do you do? He said, I was going to ask you that. I said, what you do is you take 3 of these and you go to the council and you say, I see these as the 3 top priorities. Do you agree? And when they say yes, check the booklet of 21. Put it in the archives file. Because you ain't getting to it, I can guarantee you. And that's what happens at board meetings, folks. You make decisions, you add to priorities. The question is, do we have the resources to get them done? Because otherwise, we're looking at ourselves. Can we get this done? It's a resource requirement. Ethical lines can get blurred. Board's agenda talked about that. Next. Board chair becoming the power of one. You can have a chairman that gets too strong, too powerful, starts to run the board all by themselves. Could be a lady or a man, by the way, folks. I've seen both. Some of these things are not gender specific. We include everyone. Combining and confusing the roles of chair and administrator. Some of you, by the way, when I go through this, you say, boy, he's talking about my organization. And you're right, some of yours would be impacted by some of these. Next. Levers of power, board policies. So what authority do you have? What do you run on? What's the gas in the engine? Board policy. Bylaws. Bylaws are the laws that establish the organization or the Constitution. Power to represent the membership. You've got a ton of authority when you have that. Authority to establish the strategic vision. You have the authority to establish clear goals. You have the power to set the budget. You have the authority over any staff because you have the authority through the administrator. All of those are tremendous pieces of authority and clout. Next. I'm going to close with 3 analogies. So those of you that take notes and write things down, you can jot them down if you like. One of them is called the Queen Mary. Second analogy is called Walter Payton, P-A-Y-T-O-N. And the third one is called John Landy, L-A-N-D-Y. And before I close with these, I'd say how much I appreciate you being here, how much I appreciate the work you do on behalf of your communities. I think it's invaluable. And you need to stick with it, and you need to focus on bringing others alongside to help you. I won't get a chance to say goodbye to all of you at the door, but I do appreciate you being here. Is there a question that I haven't addressed?
I don't know if this concerns to this, but you're applying for a grant for whatever, you're with it, and on the application it says put all the directors' names in, so you put 15, 20 names, and it says names, addresses, and phone numbers.
Yes.
Do you have to put addresses?
Yes.
Some of the members didn't want to do that.
For most cases with provincial government grants, it's a requirement. They have to prove that what they're doing is legitimate, and one of the ways they prove it is because they know they can find you. Some of these things are non-negotiable. Now, having said that, you could check with the province and find out if I'm right, but my guess is I am.
I did that one, and she called me back, and I says, you know, the Privacy Act? She said, okay, because...
Yeah, but they're wrong because the Privacy Act simply says you still have to fill it in. They just don't share it with anybody else. That's what that says.
I'll tell you, if you don't fill it in, your application goes directly.
Yeah. If you ever saw a long list of applications, you wanted to find yours, just go to the end of the list. I can say that if you don't comply with the requirements, chances are you won't be at the front, I can tell you that.
What's your thoughts about conference calls? We have members that are...
Conference calls, again, conference calls are fine, providing the organization has endorsed that as a way of making decisions between meetings. Conference calls still need to be recorded in terms of the motion, the issue, the resolution, and you still have to present that to the next regular meeting. So the fact that you're a widely sprung organization, wide-flung organization, yeah, you can do it. The issue is, did we use that technique to hide what it is we're doing, or did we use it because we had to save cost in terms of not meeting as a body? If you use it to save cost and distance and so on, then that's fine. It's just you have to report to the next meeting saying, what did we actually decide? Otherwise, it gets back to my email example. So when I did work for Horse Racing Alberta that Peter's on the board of, former Premier Don Getty was on the conference call from Palm Springs for, I think, 2 out of the 3 meetings. It's fine. He was a part of a decision-making process that was a legitimate process. So 3 quick analogies. One, the Queen Mary. The Queen Mary they were going to refurbish. It was a former ocean liner, now parked at Long Beach, next to, as you recall, the Spruce Goose until they moved it to Colorado. So the Queen Mary they're going to refurbish. So one of the things they're going to do is refurbish the funnels. They take down the first funnel to redo it, and as they go to pick it up and take it down, it crumbles in a pile of dust on the deck. What they found is that the funnel was held together by paint. The whole thing on the inside had deteriorated to the point that paint held it together. It's the principle of what's on the outside versus what's on the inside. Outward appearances are sometimes deceiving, folks. So what you think at first blush is the issue, what you think at first blush you're being told a la George's council at its first meeting is not necessarily what's behind the coin, what's on the other side. You're expected as governors to look deeply. You're expected as governors not to be overly impressed at first blush. Don't make a decision at the first time you see something. Just remember that expression, first heard, deferred. It simply says we need time to think this through before we jump. Second example is Walter Payton. For those of you that were sports fans would know that he was a football fullback for the Chicago Bears, ended up with the 4th leading number of yards as a fullback in NFL history. They're relatively impressive, about 9,000 yards, which, you know anything about football, is a lot of distance to carry a football. The more impressive statistic is that every 3.8 yards, he was knocked on his keister by 3 or 4 guys bigger than him. So it takes about that 9,000 yards now being divided by 3.8 per carry, and you realize how many carries that was in getting knocked over in your keister. The third most impressive statistic of this little scenario is that every 3.8 yards, he got back up again and moved forward. It's the principle of perseverance. It says to me that regardless of how many times your board gets set back, or you as a person, you are mature enough to dust yourself off and say, let's get going again. Let's keep at it. And I deal with far too many people that are prepared to fold up their tents and go home and cry and pick up their marbles and all that kind of stuff because they got set back at a particular decision. Oh, well, if you don't agree with me, I might as well quit. Geez, folks, give yourself a break. Don't join in the first place. You don't have enough Kleenex to go around. It's the principle of perseverance. Stick with it. If it's worth doing, stick with it. Read stories of people like Churchill or Lincoln or even somebody like Richard Nixon. None of them got where they got by quitting it the first time they were defeated. They'd never win where they were. And they all did good things regardless of how they ended, i.e. Nixon. They all still did a lot of good things. Third example is John Landy. For those of you that followed running, I was a runner as well as a boxer in my early days. I always joked with people in Jasper Place because they said you had to do both in order to survive. If they were too big, I ran. If they were about my size, I might have stayed and fought. But in any case, in the mid-50s, something happened that was called the Miracle Mile. The Miracle Mile was initially set by a guy named Roger Bannister, which people will recall, and he's now called Sir Roger Bannister, knighted by the Queen. Anyway, Roger Bannister first got to break the 4-minute mile. 21 days later, a guy named John Landy out of New Zealand broke Bannister's record. The two of them were scheduled to meet along with 6 other first-class milers at the British Empire Games in Vancouver at British Empire Stadium. It's now called Commonwealth Games. They met in August, I think, of '54. There's a classic picture in sports history of Landy coming around the final turn heading for home, 100 meters from home, and he's in the 2nd lane. Now, if you know anything about running middle distance, you realize once you get past the quarter mile, you get to the inside lane on 2 principles. A, it's the shortest distance, and B, you don't have to look over your left shoulder to see who's coming up behind you. Just worry about the right, because that's the only place they can pass. Well, in this case, Landy must have been bumped to the middle lane, or the 2nd lane, because he was in the 2nd lane coming home. He knew Bannister was right with them. He hears his footsteps, and there's a classic picture of Landy going like this to find Bannister. Bannister passed him on the right and beat him by 0.7 of a second. set the new world record. People remembered Bannister, forgot Landy. It's the principle of not looking back. It's the principle of looking ahead. It's Lot's wife's principle. It's the principle of the car windshield that you're about to get into. The windshield's like this, and the rearview mirror is like this. It's to check to see where you've been, or in my case in Switzerland, if I'd have looked in it, I wouldn't have hit the only post in Switzerland. It says every now and again, it's worthwhile looking back. Where have we been as an organization? The key is, you folks are elected to lead. You folks are appointed to lead. You folks are in your positions as leaders. Whether you're administrators or board governors, you're leaders. Question is, where are you going to? And that's your definition. You need to fill in the blank on that one. Thanks for being a part of this. Appreciate the day, and glad to have you with us.